Everything you need to know about change management as you embark on your digital transformation. That's what we're going to cover here in episode 226 of Transformation Ground Control.
Welcome to Transformation Ground Control. Ground Control. The podcast that covers everything related to digital transformation. This podcast features technology agnostic and international discussions related to digital strategy, software selection, implementation, change management, business process optimization, and everything else you need to know to make your digital transformation project successful. Whether you're embarking on an ERP implementation, supply chain transformation, or any other business or digital transformation, this podcast is for you. Now, here's your host, Eric Kimberling.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Ground control to Major.
Hello, welcome to episode 226 of Transformation Ground Control, the tech agnostic podcast that has everything to do with digital transformation, including the strategy, people, process, and technology components of digital transformation. Thanks for being here today. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent tech agnostic consulting firm that helps clients throughout the world reach their third stage of digital transformation success. We have offices in the US, Asia Pacific, and the EMEA, Europe, Middle East, and Africa. So if you're a client or an organization in any of those regions, please feel free to reach out to us. We're happy to help and introduce you to our local teams and help you on your journey and help you on your way in a very tech agnostic way. So I've included my contact information below if you'd like to learn more about the company or just brainstorm ideas as it relates to your project. So feel free to reach out. I've included my contact information below. So today is the change management episode. I'm excited for the conversation here today. We're going to play you a few clips that we've had in recent months talking about change management. We do cover change management quite a bit in this podcast, but I've picked out three in particular that I think are really good to get us started, to get you started on that journey and thinking about how to address change management. In addition to the interviews we'll play for you here today, or recap for you here today, I encourage you to also check out my YouTube channel where I publish a lot of stuff about change management. I also encourage you as sort of a side complementary, what's it called? An associated document that you can read as an augmentation to today's conversation. I also encourage you to read our guide to organizational change management. And it's a really detailed guide on how to address change management for your digital transformation, whether it's an ERP project or any sort of AI initiative, CRM, HCM, supply chain transformation, whatever it might be. Be sure to check that out. You can read that for free by scanning the QR code on the screen in front of you, or you can go to the links below, especially if you're watching or listening to the audio only version of this podcast. Check out the links below, and I've included a link to that guide to organizational change management. So today's episode is going to be a great one. We've got three main interviews we're going to have for you here today. One is a conversation I had with Sarah Stanley Smith and Julia Boyce from the Third Stage Consulting team out of Europe. And they're part of our very talented European change management team. And they were on the show recently talking about change management for ERP implementations, just some of the general best practices and lessons as it relates to that. And then we're going to get into a conversation I had, a live podcast that I had with myself, actually. It was just myself and the audience, taking audience questions, where I talked about top change management strategies that you should be thinking about and considering and deploying as part of your change management approach. And then last but not least, we'll have Kate Arndt on the show, who is a AI and change management expert. And she was on the show talking about AI and change management. It's a really interesting conversation because we talk about how organizations can use change management to adapt to AI and other technologies. But we also talk about how AI is affecting people's perceptions and tendency to adopt or resist technologies and changes in general. So great conversation we have lined up for your three great conversations. And with that being said, let's get started in this conversation with Sarah and Julia from the Third Stage Consulting Europe team. And this is the conversation where we talk about change management for ERP implementations. Now, this was actually a podcast I did for a sister podcast called Journey to S4HANA. And if you are by chance in the SAP space or you're implementing SAP S4HANA or you're thinking about it, you can go to journey2s4hana.com and you'll find a whole separate sister podcast where we did a series of episodes focused just on S4HANA. And even though we're tech agnostic an independent. We're not affiliated with SAP. We do a lot more than just SAP implementations. We have a podcast related or dedicated to S4HANA. We have another one related or dedicated to Microsoft D365, and we have others in the works that are focused on other types of technologies. But the reason I bring all this up is because we actually did this interview in the context of SAP, but the whole conversation, when I went back and listened to it again, it's relevant no matter what kind of ERP system you're implementing. So even though we recorded it for that podcast, this is something that's relevant to any sort of ERP implementation. So with all that being said, we'll roll you the clip of my conversation with Sarah and Julia talking about OCM for ERP implementations. Julia and Sarah, thank you for being here today.
Cool.
Thank you very much.
So Julia, let's start with you. Julia Joyce, you're from the UK. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your background.
So yeah, sure. So this afternoon I'm joining you from Scotland, where it is very cold. So if you're from Scotland this afternoon, hello. So my background in organisational change has mostly been IT implementations, so ERPs, smaller systems. I've worked with a range of different companies and industries, ranging from aviation to financial services to higher education. And most recently, the role that I'm doing is implementation of Dynamics 365 to a higher education institution.
Great. Well, thank you for being here all the way from Scotland. I apologize. I sort of lumped you into the UK. I should have differentiated.
That's all right.
Rookie mistake from the American here on the podcast. And then we also have Sarah Stanley Smith. Sarah, welcome to the show, and tell us a little bit about yourself, if you don't mind.
Sure. Yeah. Hi, guys. So I'm Sarah. I'm joining you today from Derbyshire. So if you don't know where that is, it's kind of in the middle of England. I spent the last about 12 years working in corporate change management for a variety of different clients. It's quite similar to Julia. My experience spans a number of different industries, so rail, automotive, utilities, oil, and most recently in retail. APMG practitioner certified, which is quite similar to ProSci, if you guys have come across that. And bulk of my experience really has been in digital transformations, so largely kind of ERP system upgrades. But I have also been involved in some quite quirky projects, such as sort of opening new distribution centres and office moves and things like that.
Great. And just to reiterate too, I mean, you both have experience with change management on S4HANA implementations, but as you guys have mentioned here in your introductions, also other ERP implementations as well. And I think one of the themes we're probably going to get to here today is that a lot of what we talk about today, even though the topic is S4HANA implementations, it's really relevant to any sort of ERP implementation as well. And maybe as a starting point, let's start with you, Sarah. You know, as a general starting point, why is change management so important in S4HANA implementations, or any ERP implementation for that matter?
Yes, I mean, I kind of reiterating what you're saying, Eric, that change management is absolutely crucial kind of for any ERP or digital transformation. And I think really this is because essentially these projects, whilst they're technical in nature, they're all about people. So it's all about the end users and how the end users are using that system. So at the end of the day, it's kind of the end user that has to go on that transformation journey. And they're the people who are going to be using the new system, once the project's closed down and the project team has disbanded and, moved on to other things. So in order to kind of ensure that people use that new system fully and gain all the wonderful benefits that you get, listed in the business benefits case, change management, it must be effectively embedded, and the changes to make them manageable to the end users. So again, it really goes back to, it's all about the people. And whilst you might have this, shiny new ERP tool to play with, if nobody understands kind of how to use it or why you're using it in the first place, it's just not going to work. And so that's kind of the crux of it, I would say.
Yeah, makes total sense. It seems like, S4HANA projects are so complex, and the software is so complex that, a lot of times you get so caught up in just making the technology work that you forget about that important people side, it seems. Yeah. What are your thoughts, Julia? Why is change management so important?
I think really just to echo Sarah's points is that change management is only as good as the individuals that are using it, or an ERP is only as good as the individuals that are using it. If you have a shiny multi-million-pound spanking new system that no one knows how to use, or are unhappy with it, or can't get to grips with it, or still want to use the legacy systems or spreadsheets, you really aren't going to get that return on that investment.
Right. Yeah, that's a key point. That last thing you just said about return on investment and, getting actual business value out of the system and
Yep,
deploying a system that not only works technically, but works from a people and operational perspective as well.
absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
I'd be curious to hear from the audience too. Why do you all think change is so important? Is it important? I mean, I'd be curious to hear if anyone thinks change management isn't important. I'd be surprised if we heard that, but you never know. I'd love to hear from the audience your views on change management and why it's so important. Um, how do you see change management being different for S4 HANA implementations compared to other sorts of technology or business change initiatives that you've been involved with?
Julie, do you want
Let's
to
start.
take
Let's start
that
with
one?
Julia on that one. Sorry, I'm supposed to prompt you. Who's supposed to answer the
That's
question?
okay. Um, I mean, I think initially what I would say is that every change implementation is different because there's a number of different variables in there, including what people have used before, what the organisational what's the word I'm looking for, appetite is for change, what the kind of what the culture is in the organisation. So there's lots of different variables that impact change and that change journey. And the ERP or what the solution is one of those variables. So notwithstanding those, using SAP for HANA, I think it's a big system. Okay, it's a big system with lots of bits. I think it's quite complex for people to get their heads around, especially if you've come from lots of legacy systems. Again, one of the questions is where's that gap of where you've come from to where you're going to? If you've come from, I don't know, a bunch of spreadsheets and legacy systems, that jump to SAP for HANA is potentially massive for people. It's a big jump for people to actually make in terms of their heads and their abilities and capabilities. And even if you've come from a previous iteration of SAP, it's still quite a big jump in terms of the way that it's used differently. So I think that what I'm trying to say is that every change is different, and there's lots of variables involved in delivery of that change.
Yeah, absolutely. Makes total sense. What do you think, Sarah?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, really. I mean, I think the key for me is that kind of it doesn't really matter almost what system you're using. You're still going to have to go through that same change management framework process. So you're still going to need to do, change management strategy and plan, your readiness assessments, all the comms and the training, all this really good stuff that's really important for people to make that journey. But I think it's really important to make sure that your impact assessments, so, Julia kind of mentioned it, but looking at how the organization is today and how it's going to look in the future, doing that assessment in enough depth and enough coverage is really important, because if you don't know how it's changing, you can't kind of guide people through that journey. And I think it's the same for, SAP or S4HANA, but any kind of ERP system, you're going to have to do that assessment to make sure it's effective, and ultimately make sure that people know what's going on, when we switch it on. Go live.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it makes total sense. And then I also want to turn to the audience too. I had asked a couple questions of them. I asked where they're joining from first and foremost. We have people from all over the world, as I mentioned before. We have Natalia from London, UK, Sandra from Regina, SK. It's Aditya from Calgary, Canada. Someone joining from Divya, USA, Boston, Massachusetts, New Brunswick, Canada, Curacao, Williamstead, Curacao, very pretty part of the world. So thank you all for joining here today, people from all over the world. So thank you for that. A couple comments too. This is from Tofik on LinkedIn. Tofik, and I hope I pronounced your name correctly or close to correctly. He says change management is the key to success. So at least we have one person on board so far, at least one person that's agreeing that change management is really important. So thank you for that. And then also from LinkedIn, this is from Alcinda. Alcinda says change management is one of the key levers you pull to execute a digital strategy. Otherwise, you would have just spent that investment on a shiny object that isn't used. I think that's very consistent with what you both just alluded to as well. S4HANA is a great technology, a lot of groundbreaking stuff and capability in the software, but that doesn't really matter if people aren't using it and it's not helping make the business and the operations better. So thank
Absolutely.
you for that feedback.
Yeah.
One other comment here, a follow-up here from Tafik. He says, change management is the key to success. At the end, it's people within the organization that utilize the ERP system. If the change impact is not managed within the organization and the people, the implementation process could be jeopardized. So change impact being one of the key words here. I guess just sort of maybe a follow-up question or a building on Tawfiq's point there. How big are these impacts typically that you see, with whether it's S4HANA implementations or any sort of massive ERP implementation? How big are the impacts? Are they as big as we think? Are they bigger? Like, how would you explain or summarize how big those changes are? Let's start with you, Sarah.
I mean, it really, really does depend on the organization and the people. There's so many variations to this. You can kind of open the Pandora's box, as it were, and look inside, and you've got all these really great people who are very sort of tech savvy, and perhaps the change isn't quite as big for those types of people. But I think Julia mentioned it earlier. You've got kind of colleagues that may have been using Excel for the last 20 years, instead of an ERP, and somebody who is in that scenario, that's going to be a much bigger impact to that sort of person than it might be for somebody else. So I think it really does vary. I think also there's kind of maybe a bit of a sort of a misconception that if people are already using SAP, going from SAP to S4HANA would be easy, right? But I think that's quite a risky assumption to make, just because it is quite a different tool, and it's less customizable, all these kind of things. So I think, again, you might go, oh yeah, they're already using SAP, isn't that brilliant? We'll switch it on and they'll be fine. But it's, even that can actually be a really, really big impact to quite a lot of people in the company. So just really important to make sure that impact assessment is done in that detail to uncover those things.
Yeah. What are your thoughts, Julia?
I'm just looking at the question raised by Natalia in terms of how do we structure that for an ERP. I tend to do it by process and look at, first of all, but the way that I would structure it is I would look at each department or each function that has been impacted, then have a look at those processes and work with a business analyst to look at to see what the processes are, build a process taxonomy, and then from there, what I would probably do is do a heat map of how many processes are being impacted for every team, and that will help you understand where the red areas are, areas where you want to focus more change effort than other areas, and that's a really good starting point. And then from there, there's obviously lots of different things that you can drill it down into, things like role mapping, other types of things as well. But for me, processes are at the core of that. So and leading with the process and looking at how the software is going to work with those processes, and then ultimately figuring out how's that different than the way you're doing things today. And I think so. The other thing that I wanted to say is the UI or the user interface. That's a really important thing to think about as well, because it's all very well moving to an ERP, but if you're moving to an ERP which is, let's say, fiddly to use, or its interface isn't as user friendly as you would expect, that's a challenge to change as well, is to get people to start thinking in that particular language or using that kind of skill set or expecting to see that. And if we're using the ProSci model, that's where this knowledge and ability comes into place before we go live, is to let people understand and see and play with it before we hit the ground running. And then at least then they've got a chance of, when we go live, they're more successful using it.
Yeah, absolutely. And Sarah, you had an interesting point too that I want to come back to, that I don't want to gloss over, which is the fact that if you're an existing SAP customer, let's say you're using R3 or even ECC, and there's this perception oftentimes that it's a lift and shift, it's still SAP. Yeah, it might be a little bit different, but it's for the most part going to be the same system. And to your point, it's really not. I mean, I think it's worth highlighting that point you made, which is it's a total rewrite of the technology. So it's an entirely new system. Yes, it kind of has a similar SAP look and feel that, SAP customers might find somewhat familiar, but the capabilities, the processes, the way it works, especially as you mentioned, the private cloud, and even more so the public cloud version of S4HANA is going to be less flexible, and it's going to be probably a bigger change than you think for a lot of organizations, especially if you have a lot of customizations in your legacy SAP environment. You're not going to have that in the new environment, presumably.
I think that's actually a really big issue, because that kind of creates, I find, a lot of change resistance. So people who are used to the customization element and quite enjoy that aspect of it, to have that taken away, it's a very hard thing to then sell to people. You know, they go, oh, where's my, you know, whatever it is, I'm used to doing it this way. And all of a sudden, you know, the change manager's coming in and saying, oh, yeah, we're taking all that lovely customization away from you. How do you feel about that? So it's quite difficult. And if that's not managed properly and given kind of the time and the engagement that is needed with the end users, it can become a really negative thing, and people go, I don't want this, and they kind of actively start to resist it, which is, you know, where you really, really don't want to be.
Yeah, that's a good point. And maybe I'll ask you this, Julia. This is off script. I'll warn you ahead of time. I didn't prep you for this question, but when you think about some of the emerging technologies that SAP and other vendors have, like artificial intelligence, machine learning, and some of the analytics and things, some of the automation technologies that maybe are a bit more, call it aggressive in the ability to automate a human's job. Do you guys see that being is that a bigger threat? Is that create more change resistance? In other words, do the more advanced technologies that can actually do more and deliver more business value, does that create more of a threat to people? And from a change management perspective, what do you think, Julia?
Funnily enough, I'm starting off a digital transformation with the organisation that I'm working with at the moment, and part of that is about encompassing AI into that. And while I feel like the organisation has done some research of that into the past. It's a university, so they've done some research into how students feel about AI. And the research that came out was that they feel that it's part threat and part opportunity as well. But I think the fear with people is that they don't understand how to use it properly. What would be for a student, for example, to be or what is just using AI to do what it's meant to do. So I think there's a real mix of feeling that it's a threat and it can take over your job, but there's also a real feeling that with proper education about AI and chat GPT and all of the other things, is that there is a feeling that it is potentially a good opportunity for us for an organisation to take a step change digitally, to move forward into that world. But again, it's about that messaging and management of that message, and not letting people just run with their own perceptions of what AI is.
Right. Yeah. What do you think, Sarah?
Yeah, I agree. And I think you've hit it on the head there, Julia, when it's about, you know, saying it's about messaging, because at the end of the day, if all this great new stuff's coming into the business and we haven't properly told the person what that means for them, people tend to go for kind of, if you've got options on the table, they tend to go for the negative one and go, oh, that means I'm going to lose my job, even if it's not the case. And if you haven't kind of taken people through that engagement journey, people get really worried, and then performance drops, all these kind of horrible things that you really want to avoid. So I think the key is to kind of explain it to people in the way that they understand, but be really open and honest about people and give them time to digest what's happening. And if you can do that, people are much more willing to kind of engage with it and start to embrace the change, rather than going, oh no, this is automatically bad for me. I'm going to do this active quitting kind of sort of step away kind of thing. Because again, that's the worst scenario, which you really want to try and avoid.
Yeah, active quitting. That's a good thread to pull into this too. It seems like that's the thing that a lot of organizations overlook is they look for the obvious sabotage resistors, you know, the people that are just blatantly opposed to the project. And those people are hard to find because there's usually not that many of them. And usually that's not the biggest threat. It seems like the biggest threat are the active quitters, the people that they're on board with change in general, but now that you're rocking my world or disrupting my world, now I'm going to resist it because I'm not as excited about it now that you're telling me I'm going to change my job.
It's quite contagious as well, isn't it? Sorry, Julia, I was just going to say there's this kind of rolling effect. You sort of see one person who starts to maybe panic a little bit, and then it spreads and it's like wildfire, you know, and it's once that's happened, it's a really hard fire to put out, I find, whereas you could have probably prevented it in the first place by doing your change management effectively.
Yeah. And I think there, just to touch on a question that I can see that someone's asked, is about expectations management. And yes, you're absolutely right, is that it's about setting that clear vision at the end, what the organization is going to look like and what it's going to look like for an individual stroke team stroke department is really important so that they can buy into it. Absolutely, it's the fear of the unknown. If you just say we're changing and we've got a digital transformation, I'm a change manager. I would panic at that because I think I don't know what that means. What does it mean? Am I going to be asked to do something that I don't know how to do? Do I have to learn a new system? Is it going to be harder? Is it going to take away? Am I going to lose my job? Sell a vision, be clear about the vision and the disbenefits that that might bring, because clearly, there may be disbenefits, there may be an organizational restructure, but along with that comes benefits, and at least you've been honest and transparent, and that really helps people at the outset of the journey get it in their head and helps them move forward that little bit, because what we don't want people to do is to stay where they are or to move back. We want people to be moving forward in that change journey, even incrementally, even just a little step forward at any time.
Yeah, makes total sense. And sort of I think we're leading into or a nice segue into another question I had for you is, why do so many organizations and project teams overlook the importance of change management? If it's as important as we're all saying it is, the audience seems to be in agreement that yes, change management's important. Then why do organizations and project teams overlook that so much? Why don't we start with you, Sarah?
Sure, I kind of think it's twofold, actually. So maybe this is a slightly kind of used to happen more than it did in the past, because I know sort of change management, I think, is being more embraced as time goes on and people do start to see the value of it. But in my personal experience, I've had a lot of people kind of view it as being this kind of fluffy, nice to have thing. We come in and we do a bit of communications, we might do a bit of training, we're a bit of cheerleading for the project or whatever it might be. But I think this is kind of a fundamental misconception of the value that change management can bring, and it can really hinder, your ERP program or your digital transformation. And I kind of think the main problem or the main issue around this is that people don't fully understand what change management is and what value it can bring. So in my mind, I think you could or you should view it as being just as crucial to a project as project management, for example. So you wouldn't start one of these projects without a project manager. You shouldn't start one without a change manager either. So I think that's kind of the first thing. I think the second thing is that people have often had quite a bad experience on change programs, possibly because there hasn't been a change manager or they've been kind of thrown in at the end and it hasn't worked out for whatever reason. So there might be this kind of negative buildup of, I've been through change before and it was terrible and change management is rubbish because it doesn't work. But it's 9 times out of 10, it's because it hasn't been done properly or it hasn't been given the opportunity to kind of deliver that value. So I think those are kind of two things, quite different things going on, but in my experience, they're sort of semi-common, which is slightly worrying.
Yeah.
I think it's also about the change maturity of the organization as a whole. I don't think I've worked with many organizations where they've been particularly mature at business change. So change management tends to happen sporadically because they have a project manager or a program director who knows about it, and then we organically come in like moles and say hi, and then we deliver good change, and then that helps spread the message. And I think that's quite common. I think that even if you have a change management organization or a change management office or some sort of center of excellence as well, I do think people still, they need to do a really good PR job more than anybody else in terms of the benefits that change management brings. Because otherwise people will still cling on to this idea that we're just about comms and training, and then therefore that is seen as an added cost and an overhead that could potentially be done by the project manager or a BA, insert other existing person on the project. And that's part of the problem as well, is that change management needs really strong PR.
Yeah, that's it. You bring up a really good point, Julia, and that is you mentioned that oftentimes people will view change management as training and comms. And I think that's probably the two most obvious first things that we think of when we think of change management. We think about, we've got to train people how to use the system, and we've got to do some communication to make sure people understand what's going on with the project and what the changes are at a high level. How would you summarize, maybe I'll start with you, Julia, since you triggered this question in my head. How would you summarize just some of the other things without going into detailed methodologies necessarily, but what are some of the major components of change management outside of train the trainer and basic communications?
Yeah, sure. Okay. So first of all, we start off with stakeholders. stakeholder analysis, stakeholder identification, and from there create a stakeholder strategy to make sure that you have categorized your stakeholders and you're bringing them along with you on that journey as well, to make sure that you've got some way of making sure that you've given the right people the right messages at the right time outside of mass communications. Okay, that's not necessarily done by the change manager, but you're encouraging the sponsor and whoever is best placed to take that message forward. So making sure that you're, let's say, building a coalition of change that way. So that's one thing. I think secondly, we've touched on it, is the bit that's absolutely core to me is this change impact assessment. You will never be able to deliver, well, you might be by luck, but certainly not by design, successful change if you don't understand the core of what is actually changing. So there's a massive piece of work that needs to be done about understanding the processes, understanding the process taxonomy, looking at what they're going from where they're going to, understanding that gap, understanding how big that change is for each of those areas or each of those teams, individuals, departments, however you want to break it down, and then looking to see how you're going to build that gap for change. Now, that could be communications, it could be training, it could be a number of other things, but for me, change impact is the absolute core of what we do, and that has got nothing to do with comms and nothing to do, that's the output of that comms and training. The change impact is the absolute core of what we do.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great overview. What would you add anything to that, Sarah, as far as major work streams within change management?
Yeah, I mean, I guess in addition to those kind of key bits, because obviously I do reiterate what Julia is saying, the impact assessment is absolutely crucial, and kind of everything else does spit out from that. But you've got items such as, business readiness assessments to make sure that the business is kind of ready and able and capable to take on the change. Another kind of key bit, which is kind of linked to communications and engagement, is your change network change agency network. So essentially, we kind of leading into this sort of building coalition of change, creating a network of internal advocates for your change that can then kind of help drive and deliver. And they do help with kind of the training and the comms, but it's kind of it's the piece that comes before delivering those kind of key bits of work. And then I kind of on top of that, and towards the end of the project, actually, we get involved heavily in kind of support models, hypercare, lessons learned, all this kind of really good stuff as well that kind of helps with adoption and embedment. So it's kind of an all-encompassing role, actually, which is probably why we're tired quite a lot of the time, because we end up doing a lot of stuff. But in my experience, if you're on kind of a large ERP program, you will have a change manager, but you also have a training manager and a comms manager. So that kind of tells you that there's key roles for those two sections in addition to the change manager. So it really isn't just all about that. It's all this other really good stuff that kind of paints the picture as well.
Yeah. And you mentioned earlier, Sarah, you were talking about how resistance to change can spread like wildfire. Yeah. And a lot of times, I'm sure you have both seen this in your careers. A lot of times as change practitioners, you get pulled into a firefighting situation where the change management is just out of control, tons of resistance. The rest of the project might be going fine. The technical piece of it might be going fine. We've built a system that works, but now we've got some change issues and it's a mess, So I guess the question becomes, when should change management start so that we can avoid the wildfires and proactively get ahead of that resistance and turn it into a business value proposition instead of a firefighting proposition? What do you think, Sarah? When should change management begin?
I mean, as early as possible is always the answer to that question. So I kind of think as soon as you've got your project manager and your project team is being built, that's when the change manager needs to come in. Quite a lot of, or in my experience, I think quite a lot of organizations tend to get this wrong. And I'm not sure if it's because of kind of competing priorities or, it's an extra financial burden to bring somebody in sooner. But it's really crucial because kind of as we've alluded to at the front end of the project, we do so much information kind of gathering and data collection on how the organization is functioning. If we're brought in later, we're kind of playing catch up, and it's almost too late to kind of spend a good couple of months, whatever it is, kind of understanding the organization when you're trying to understand the future, if that makes sense. So I think, as soon as you've got your discovery phase going on and maybe the system implementator is coming on board to talk people through the new system and the benefits, that's where we should be starting, and be party to all of those technical meetings as well, just so that we've got kind of the ammunition and the material that we need to build those comms and engagement plans with the information that you get at that really early stage.
Yeah, absolutely. What do you think, Julia? Anything to add to that?
No, other than to echo Sarah's comments, it's absolutely about setting the scene and understanding up front. To link that back to resistance as well, there's two ways that I like to manage resistance. Is first of all anticipated resistance. What do you expect people to be doing, so that you can build a strategy to deal with that. As you progress through the change, you will find that resistance pops out of anywhere, and there's you obviously have to manage that as you go along. But apart from anything else, being in at the beginning can help you understand the landscape. It can help you understand who the teams are. Talking to stakeholders can help you understand their thoughts and things. And as well, if you bring change in at the beginning, that helps ensure that your leadership is aligned. Okay, so what you don't want to do, or certainly what I don't want to do, is to go through the change and find out that your key stakeholders, your sponsor network, or whatever you want to call them, has a different idea of what's happening. Bringing change management in at the beginning can help safeguard against that, so that your stakeholders are all in agreement about what's going to happen, that resistance from them is negated, and therefore they become ambassadors for change, and they can help manage resistance within their own teams and functions and areas.
Yeah, well said. Yeah, it's a good approach. Now, speaking of approaches and just sort of the way we tackle change management, SAP has their Activate methodology that many, if not most, organizations deploying S/4HANA will use. Does that Activate methodology give us what we need to deploy change management successfully?
I'll take this one. I'm going to say no. Looking at the methodology itself, change management appears to be in the layer that says project management, and I don't think that there's enough detail to that as well. And I think that's very much limited to things like mass communications and train the trainer. Hopefully in the past 35 minutes that we've identified that change is much more deeper and wider than those things as well. So I feel like if you were going to look at you're going to rely on the Activate methodology on its own, I really wouldn't be confident that you're going to get the level of return of investment from your people that you think that you're going to get from spending millions of pounds or dollars or whatever currency on a new ERP. However, I think that if you were to use a change manager with the Activate methodology and to complement that, that could work. But I would say on its own, it doesn't make me happy that it's included everything that I would do as a change manager for any project, let alone a large scale ERP digital transformation.
Yeah. What are your thoughts, Sarah?
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you're going to just use that as a methodology in its own without the change management aspect, the people element just won't fly unless you have a miracle. Right. I think. However, I do think the Activate methodology has some good bits to it in terms of the change management side of things. So the stages that it goes through, so the discover, prepare, explore, etc. I think those are really good phases to be able to hang your change management plan off. I think there was a question actually, and I've lost it now, but it was kind of how do project managers, I think, work with, would you set up two separate work streams or would you manage together versus separately? So I think that's quite interesting here, because you've kind of got your project management work stream, your tech work stream that will use the Activate methodology, and your change management work stream will run in parallel to that. So for the discovery phase, for example, when users are getting familiar with the benefits of SAP, that's when we would come in and do some analysis in terms of, benefits realization, prep, and all that kind of good stuff. So I think, very long-winded answer to your question, I think it's kind of doing it in tandem, and you can't really have one without the other. I think they need to be done together to get a successful result. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I feel like that if you look at the Activate methodology on a page, there's a lot of weighting attached to other things like data integration and all of those things, and project management and change management is down the bottom. And I feel like they're all equally important as each other. You can have the best, data integration transformation if you want to, and the best data quality, but without project management and that discipline and change management discipline, do you know what I mean? I feel like it's suggesting that something is more important than another, and actually, I would disagree with that.
Yeah, it almost, when I look at the Activate methodology, and it's not just Activate, by the way, it's the methodologies of other ERP
Yeah.
vendors as well. But when
Yes.
you look at some of these methodologies like Activate, I feel like it's the technologist view of how a software should be deployed, and then they realize, wait, we do need to add some change management here. So let's pepper in a couple, training. Let's do some train the trainer. Let's do some basic communications, just so we can say we covered it. But
Yeah.
I think what we're saying here is there's a lot more to it than kind of your basic technology driven change management focus.
Yeah.
I'm here with Sarah and Julia from the Third Stage Consulting Europe team talking about OCM for ERP implementations. I've got a lot more questions for them. There's a lot more to cover in this interview. But first, we're going to take a quick break. We'll be back with more Transformation Ground Control.
Show me how to lie, you're getting better all the time, and turning all against one is an art that's hard to teach. Another clever word.
I'm excited to announce the release of our 2025 Digital Transformation Report. It's available now on the Third Stage Consulting website, www.thirdstage-consulting.com. This report gives you an unbiased, technology-agnostic insight to help you optimize your organization's projects for success. Get your copy today using the QR code in front of me or on our website.
Are you looking for ways to promote your product or service to enterprise technology decision makers and influencers throughout the world, like the ones who listen to this podcast? Major Tom Productions creates media, events, and influencer marketing for B2B technology providers. Our productions are exciting, educational, disruptive, and effective. Most importantly, they create results. Our content is unlike any other in this industry, engaging, influential, and trusted by technology buyers and influencers throughout the world. Each month, our productions reach hundreds of thousands of targeted buyers and decision makers who trust and engage with our honest and tech-agnostic content. With long-tail viral results and engagement with our content, Major Tom Productions provides a way to reach your target market and create awareness, calls to action, and a connection with potential customers. So, collaborate with us today. Learn how we can feature your product or service on podcasts such as Transformation Ground Control, Journey to S/4HANA, and Journey to Dynamics 365. We can also feature your brand on our YouTube channel called Digital Transformation with Eric Kimberling, which boasts over 100,000 subscribers and over 2 million video views per year. You can also participate in our in-person events, including our Digital Stratosphere Conference. Contact us today to learn more. We can tailor a marketing campaign that works for you. We look forward to helping more people learn more about and become engaged with your brand.
With 1,000 eyes and a good disguise, hit 'em right between the eyes, hit 'em right between the eyes, when you walk away.
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 226. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent tech-agnostic consulting firm that helps clients throughout the world with their digital transformation journeys. And you can find new episodes of this show every Wednesday by going to transformationgroundcontrol.com. I'm here with Sarah and Julia from the Third Stage Europe team talking about OCM in ERP implementations.
There was another question, sorry, about somebody, I think Natalia asked about how you demystify change management for tech teams. I think that's quite pertinent here as well, because I think this is all kind of hinging on the technology and the system, but not having kind of that, what's the word I want, kind of a roadmap and a strategy for change management in its own right. So in terms of demystifying, again, it's another good reason to bring us in early, because we can spend some time with the tech teams basically saying, hi, this is what we do.
Yeah.
Here's how we can help you. This is what value we can bring, and kind of get that really good professional relationship working up front. And then everybody kind of understands each other. So I think it's spending that time, isn't it? Yeah.
And actually, to echo Sarah's point, for me, architects and developers are absolutely key in terms of helping me understand the technical landscape so that I can translate that into something that is helpful for our users. It's very difficult to get information from somebody that doesn't understand what you do, because they feel like, why should I? Or they're taking my homework. Explaining to an architect or to somebody else in the technical sphere what you're here to do unlocks and helps broker that relationship, so that you can extract what they've got in their mind and take that and use that as valuable collateral to help deliver that change message. So it's happened to me absolutely loads, where I will nicely suggest that we have a working session on change management. I'll talk through the roadmap, I'll talk through ADCAR or whichever methodology that we're using, and allow them to ask questions and explain why I need them to be part of my world as well, and make them feel important, not just that I'm just here to take over the world, but I need what's in their brains to help me do my job as well. And that tends to work quite well, and they do get infused and engaged because they can see the benefit of it, and they can see the benefit of it for them as well.
Right. Yeah, that's really well put. And one other thing I wanted to maybe add on to what you're both saying about, whether or not, going back to the point about whether or not the Activate methodology covers enough of what we need with change management, is you have to look at what SAP as a company is doing with the migrations of their customers too. They have the 2027 deadline to get legacy customers off of VCC and R3. And then they've also introduced this RISE program that's meant to get more of their legacy customers moved over to SAP S/4HANA Cloud. So SAP's focus as a company really is on getting as many of their customers shifted over to S/4HANA as quickly as possible within a pretty narrow window. And what I worry about is in the midst of all that chaos and that rush to get people moved over to S/4HANA, where does that leave change management? And are we going to focus enough time and effort? Do we have enough resources? Do we have enough time to focus on change management? That's what I worry about with S/4HANA implementations. I don't expect you guys to have an answer to that necessarily, but it is something I think undermines the importance of change management, which is why I think you're seeing so many S/4HANA implementations that are struggling and failing right now, is partially because people are rushing to try and just deploy technology for technology's sake.
Yeah, I've encountered that quite a lot of times, where people just say, we want an ERP, we want a digital transformation, we want it now for whatever reason, and that doesn't make it successful having it next week.
Right.
Well thought out, well managed change journeys involving and bringing your people together are what guarantees success. It's one thing to say to a board or to report as a sponsor, yes, I've delivered an X shiny new system, but the real success metric isn't when you go live. The real success metric is that reinforcement. What are people doing a year later? How well has it been used in anger? How well people have adopted to that? What's your attrition rate with staff? How do people feel about it? That's your success measure.
Right.
I do worry that, as you're saying, Eric, with this deadline, if things are kind of rushed towards the end, oh gosh, we've got 6 months left to do this. Let's get a whole team of change managers in because that'll fix it. Again, that's creating, we spoke about it earlier, but that negative experience of change management, because that's not how it's supposed to be. And I do worry there'll be a lot of companies suddenly go, oh my gosh, we've got to hit this target. And then it's going to cause so many problems, in sort of 12, 18 months down the line, when, as Julia said, people are going, oh yeah, we don't know how to use it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. We're not getting any business value out of it, but we spent a lot of money.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Absolutely. Yeah. For sure. 100%.
There's a question I want to come back to from Kyler on LinkedIn. This is a great question. It sort of ties into what we're talking about here on this thread of, is the Activate methodology enough? And I think what we're saying is it gives us a starting point or some bits and pieces of methodology to begin with, but we've got to augment Activate with real change management muscle. And here's another sort of similar question that Kyler has on LinkedIn is, do you really need an outside independent or tech agnostic change management firm to support change management in an S/4HANA implementation, or can it be handled by the system integrator? Maybe I'll just add another layer to this. Do system integrators typically do this stuff in your experience? Is that enough? If we say, hey, we've hired one of the big or one of the major system integrators, they'll handle change management for us. Is that a reasonable expectation, or what's your experience been? Start with you, Sarah.
So in my experience, I was going to say, like, sort of 99% of the people I've worked for have got an outside OCM companies come in, or relied on kind of permanent change managers if they have the resource to get those guys involved. And I personally think that works better, just because I feel like the SI has its own priorities, and they're not always the same as the change management element. So if you are external to that SI when they come in, you're able to challenge more effectively, I think, when maybe the people element isn't being considered as highly as it should. Whereas if you're kind of within that sort of SI bubble, you're going to go with the SI company's priorities, rather than going, actually, guys, wait a sec, we haven't thought about, I don't know, the finance team over here, and we haven't given them enough attention, or whatever the case may be. So I definitely think it's more beneficial having people on the outside, unless you've got a system implementator who is very keyed up on change management and has that freedom to allow the change manager to kind of, challenge, I think.
Yeah.
For me, I think change management is a, I don't know, let's call it a critical friend. Is that that objectivity is key for me, because you're the one person that's trying to, or you're one team that's trying to manage that, resistance. It's trying to, get people to come round to your way of thinking, and you do need to be objective, and you do need I think part of the skill of being a change manager is being able to say, is having the confidence to say, look, in terms of change, a metric, we are red because people aren't ready to go. So while you might be on time, on budget, your scope might be fine. Actually, if your people aren't ready to go, then you're not, and you need to have that confidence to be able to say that. And sometimes as a change manager, you don't, as I'm segueing slightly, but sometimes as one person, a lone voice, is that you don't always have that backup to tell you that. So being a change manager and being that objective person, it's about getting relationships with your sponsor and making sure your sponsor understands and listens the importance of it, so they can give that message as well. And being objective is really what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. It seems like, in my experience too, system integrators or any implementation partner of SAP, they sort of have their blinders on, not because they want to be blinded, but because they're so focused on S/4HANA as a product. And my job is to deploy S/4HANA, and my job is to get people to use S/4HANA, and that's fine. You need that skill set, obviously, on a project team. But what you guys are saying is a little bit different. You're not coming at it from a SAP first perspective. You're coming at more from a business and people first perspective. And we've got to figure out how to bridge that gap between S/4HANA first and now business and technology. How do we translate that S/4HANA competency over into actual usage and value and adoption?
We want to make sure people are moving at the same, or the people are moving at the same speed as the technology, really. And we need,
it can be really tricky sometimes, can't it? To make sure you've got that balance right. But
Well, especially because technology is changing, so it's exponentially increasing its rate of change, and we as humans are not changing really any faster. I mean, I guess we've gotten used to change maybe a little bit more, but I would argue we're not capable of moving as fast as technology is changing, and which puts even more pressure and more importance on change management.
Definitely.
What do you think some of the biggest challenges are? I know we've touched on some of this already, but when you look at an S/4HANA implementation or any ERP implementation for that matter, what are some of the biggest challenges that you see from a change management and people perspective? Let's start with you, Julia.
Sorry, since I started to speak.
Yeah, that's right. I keep forgetting to prompt.
Give me time to think.
I think there are many, and again, as we said, it's dependent on lots of things. I think that one of the biggest challenges with doing a digital transformation and moving to an ERP is the scale of the change and the jump from the using spreadsheets and legacy systems into an all singing, all dancing one system that looks and feels completely different, and you'll have to work completely different. That is a big mental jump for people to make. With or without change management, we can, obviously our job is to make that easier for people, but that is a big challenge in people's heads. And also what I wanted to say is that change management is about appealing to people's hearts and minds. And so while you can train people and say, right, to do this process, you press that button there and then that button, and then you press save and then you do something else, that's fine. You're teaching them about the process. But in order to get the value from an ERP, it's about appealing to people's hearts and minds about the benefits of an ERP. And I think that sometimes can be overlooked, is that we're trying to look big picture here about the vision. So that leads me on to one of the biggest challenges, and something that I've experienced a couple of times is trying to get your senior people, your sponsors, to nail down the vision. So quite often they'll say, right, we want to do X, or we want to have an ERP or a digital transformation or whatever they want to have. And then the natural question that we would ask as change managers is to say, what does that look like? Tell me, paint a picture of what that looks like for this function, for that function. How does it look like for each function? How does that fit with architecture? And they go, don't really know. We just want a digital transformation. So stage one is to pull it out of their head and make sure that everybody understands how that's working and what it looks like, so that we've got something to sell. It's very difficult to deliver change, and where people are going, well, what you actually delivering? We're going, I don't really know. We need
Right.
to know to be able to do our jobs properly. So those are some of the challenges that we get. There are many. I could talk forever about them, but those are just some off the top of my head.
Yeah. What would you add to that, Sarah?
I think it's kind of linked to that, actually, is that the process Julie's kind of just given us an overview of is quite long-winded, or it can be, because if kind of your senior leadership and your sponsors haven't really got an idea of what it is they want, it does take quite a lot of time and effort to get that out of people. And I think often it's a case of, oh, just have a meeting and, we'll get some outputs and it will be fine. But I think people don't appreciate how long some of the activity that we do takes. And people get frustrated because they kind of go, oh, you can have X done in a month, it will be fine. But if it doesn't go to plan, it's, oh, we haven't got time to go back and redo it, or whatever it is. So I think it's just this lack of appreciation about how difficult it is, actually, I think, to take people on a change management journey. It really is, and it can vary quite a lot. So it's quite an unpredictable thing to be able to sort of scope out. At the start of a project, your sponsor might say to you, right, well, how long is it going to take? And you go, well, I don't know yet, because I haven't done the analysis to be able to sort of define how complicated it's going to be. So yeah, kind of this lack of appreciation, I think, in terms of the time and the effort it takes is a big thing. Hence, again, why we need to be sort of involved really early on, so we can kind of go through that journey with the sponsors and the leadership.
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, it's you look at how many project teams and organizations put together their S/4HANA implementation plan based on a proposal from an SI that's based on a technical implementation. And then you look at the magnitude of change, and obviously the magnitude of change could be anywhere from a lot of change to a real lot of change, or somewhere in between. And that's ultimately going to determine how quickly you can deploy S/4HANA or any technology. But yet so many organizations don't start change management until later. So it's like, how can you really know how long a project's going to take and how much you're going to spend and how much chaos it's going to cause within your organization, unless you've done some sort of organizational assessment up front as part of your planning process? And that, I don't know is that a common challenge you guys see, or how have you navigated that in the past?
I think it's more common than it really should be, isn't it? Because I think, again, it comes back to this kind of concept that people don't really understand what the change management aspect is. So I think kind of the way I approach it is to kind of speak with your leadership about it and kind of show them the value of what doing this, this particular activity early will bring you, versus what happens if we leave it too late. And sort of really high level, but depicting those scenarios, I think is quite powerful in going, this is why we need to do it now. If we don't, these are the things that are going to, likely to happen. Yeah.
Here's Alcinda's bringing the heat here with a lot of really good questions, which I like. So Alcinda on LinkedIn asked a really good question, sort of related to this all, which is, who should own change management during a digital transformation process? Is it the human capital function, the business itself, or someone else? Who owns change management within an organization, or who should it be?
I think there's a number of different models that you can use. I've worked in organizations where the change managers have belonged to the business. Where I'm working now, they work within the IT function. So it partially depends on the business and how that works. I find that when you're part of the business, there's a risk that you can be on the side of the business and you're not truly independent. What I would advocate for is a model that is where it allows you to be objective and challenge appropriately. And I don't know. I mean, it depends on it depends on how much. For example, human capital is involved in the change. Again, I think the key questions that I would ask are: does it allow you, the change manager, to be objective? Does it allow them to freely answer and ask questions that might be difficult? or are they reined in and curtailed by the politics of their department? That's where it starts to get a little bit sticky. So I would advocate something that is objective, independent, however that looks in the organization. I don't know, because every organization is different, but that's where I would feel more comfortable. But I would also add to that as well, is that a change management model where you have a close-ish working relationship with the sponsor is absolutely key. If you are 3 steps removed from the sponsor and you can't speak to them because it has to be the project manager and they have to broker that conversation, that's going to dilute down the messages that you've got, because they may not want to deliver that message, and you're reliant on them to deliver the message that you want to do and get the answer that you need. So yeah, it depends, but anything that allows you to have an open and honest relationship with your sponsor is a good one for me.
Yeah, pretty good. What would you add to that, Sarah?
I think I'd just add that change management can never be isolated or insular. So because the nature of the change, especially with ERPs, tend to be company wide, I think it doesn't necessarily matter where you're sat. Obviously, you need to have buy-in from that particular department. But say, for example, your change management, your line is sat in the IT department. I think it's really important that you have sponsors or leaders in other departments within the company that are bought in, so that when you're trying to deliver something that maybe isn't kind of in the IT swim lane, you've got an advocate in the other business areas to support you with that. Because otherwise what happens is you try to deliver something or achieve something in a different swim lane, and nobody gets it. Nobody gets, why are you doing it? And then the IT might get a bit annoyed that you're stepping out of the swim lane. So you kind of need to have this, as Julia said, this model that's kind of spread out across the organization. And it links to something I mentioned earlier about your sort of change agent network. This sort of, coalition of change, it has to be people kind of at the bottom rung, but also at that leadership level. So, somebody to have your back and have your agenda front of mind when you're going into these different kind of scenarios. That's really important.
Yeah. It's you have to think about you talked earlier about change impact and some of the readiness activities that need to happen. I mean, you have to figure out who's going to do this stuff and who's most qualified to do it, and how can you organize it in a way that's integrated and part of the team. Do you see that? I'm curious to hear your perspectives on this, and maybe we can start with you, Sarah, since you brought it up. But do you see it more often than not that the change team, there's a tendency to want to have a separate change team, separate work stream that's off in a silo doing its own thing? Or have you seen pretty good intuition or success from organizations that want to integrate change management into the program?
I think it's so varied. I can think of examples that I've experienced from both sides. I think sometimes the danger is if you've got a change team and say you've got a change director of change who isn't a change manager at heart, is in maybe they're more of a program director, that can kind of derail that change ethos almost. And I think then you tend to kind of go into a siloed work stream where everybody's kind of, heads down, not really talking to anybody else. But I think if you've got a leader of said change team that's really proactive in kind of brokering those relationships on behalf of the change team, that's where it really works. Somebody at the top advocating for that, getting you a seat at the table at these meetings you need to be at. Otherwise, the danger is, you just kind of stick in your swim lane, go around in circles, and then you put your head up 18 months later and don't know what's going on around you, which is a terrible place to be.
Right. Yeah, you've got mass chaos on your hands, and the wildfires have spread, as you said earlier.
Yeah.
Yeah. What about you, Julia? Anything you'd add to that?
No, I think, to be honest, I think Sarah's covered everything that I wanted to say there, really.
Yeah, that's a good response. I guess just to let me get one more comment here too before I move on to my next question. This is from Shanice on LinkedIn. Says, completely agree with Sarah. Change agents are vital to delivering successful change. So thank you for that feedback, Shanice, and I agree with both of you as well. So I guess just to sort of wrap this all up and to tie this all together, everything we've talked about so far, what sort of closing advice or tips do you have for organizations and project teams that are about to start either their change management initiative within an S/4HANA implementation, or they're just starting an S/4HANA journey? How do they get started? Because we've covered a lot of ground, right? There's a lot of stuff that can fall into change management. There's a lot of stuff that should fall into change management. What's the best way to get started to really give us something tangible that we can sort of springboard into our change program? Let's start with you, Julia.
I would say first of all, okay, so there's two different models here. Is model number one, obviously the best option is to have a change manager there to do that work for you and to work with you. If that's not available, I would say if somebody else is doing that role, the key thing to do is is to make sure that you understand the change. So very first thing up front, I would say, is do you have an agreed vision? Do you understand what everybody's getting at the end, something that they can buy into, sell? So what's the selling point? Does everybody agree what that is? If not, get one, because your change trying to sell that isn't going to be successful if no one knows what the box on the jigsaw looks like. Secondly, is it looking at your people? Is that change impact assessment? What processes, and I'm not saying it's easy, but which processes are, and again, you'll be working with potentially the business analyst to do this, but which processes are in scope, and how people are impacted in that. And that will help you understand, even if it's just, not saying just training, but if the only thing that you have the ability, stroke budget, stroke capability to do is training, at least then you're making sure that the right people get trained on the right things. That's the thing that I would say. But obviously, having a business change manager would do all of those things with their expertise and more, and cover all of those things, have those conversations with sponsors for you, understand resistance, and help you through that journey.
Right. How about you, Sarah? What would you add as far as getting started on the S/4HANA and or change management journey?
I think in addition to that, because obviously that's really important what Julie's just said, is, and this is a really simple one, but have a plan. So it goes for, if you've got a change team or a change manager, or maybe somebody else who's trying to do the change management journey for you because, resources, etc. Having a good, robust plan that you stick to. Obviously, things do change. I think it's really important. Quite a lot of the time, you've got your project plan in kind of, MS Project or whatever it is. It looks great, but change management sometimes just a tiny little swim lane in that. I think it's really important that you take that plan and actually build your own change management version, so things don't get missed, because it's so complicated and there's so many things you need to remember. Having it all written down and sort of presenting it back to the project team on a weekly basis just keeps you honest with it. And it gives people the chance to go, oh, maybe we've missed something, or have you thought about that? And kind of opens those conversations up. So yeah, really early on, get a plan together, and monitor it throughout. Don't just go, right, plan, done, tick, and never revisit it. It's kind of one of these live documents that you have to have throughout. Yeah.
Makes total sense. And I think along those lines too, one thing we've seen work, and I know the three of us have worked together, third stage on this too, is just doing that organizational readiness assessment up front to sort of a precursor to the change impact assessment that you talked about, that you both have talked about throughout this conversation. Change impact is once you get into the specific and more detailed process changes that are going to affect people. And that's typically, a bit down the path of implementation. But even before you start the implementation, doing an organizational readiness assessment to say,
Definitely,
this is the culture, this is where the pockets of resistance are likely to be, and sort of trying to anticipate how big this change is going to be and how the organization is going to respond to it, so you can put together that plan that you guys talk about. That's something you can do right away, is organizational assessment leading to the overall plan and strategy that you're going to deploy as part of your implementation.
Yeah, I think that also helps you with risks as well, because therefore you can point out what the risks are. If there's a program raid or a project raid, those feed into that, and at least then that will help them get fed up to board level or to sponsor level, and they appear as they might have been missed off otherwise. But yes, that's absolutely important, absolutely essential.
And I'll add one more follow-up bonus question here. So what about, I'm an executive here. I'm an executive sponsor. I'm listening to this conversation. And I think, this all sounds great. Change management, I can see why it's important to most organizations. But our team is really excited about this change. I mean, we just picked S/4HANA. We're just getting started on the project. And I'm looking around and everyone's pretty excited. So I don't think change is going to be a problem for us. But I get it, why it's important for everyone else. So what would you say to that executive that has that mindset, which we often see?
I think I'd say that it's very easy to be excited at the start of the project, but as time goes on and sort of things come up that are unexpected that might cause a bit more chaos than you anticipated, or people get change fatigue, all this kind of stuff. If you haven't got that kind of experienced change management person to help guide you through those situations, I think that excitement can quite quickly turn into resentment. And you kind of get these people who are getting really frustrated and go, oh, I'm done with this. So I think, yes, it's really good if your organisation is very excited, but you've got to keep that momentum up. And in order to do that, I think you need a good change management strategy in place. Absolutely.
It's the expertise to be guided through that change.
Yeah.
By somebody that is an expert in that particular capability.
So that was my conversation with Sarah and Julia from the Third Stage Consulting Europe team. A great conversation, very talented group of change professionals in those two. And hopefully you learned as much as I did from having that conversation. So we've got a lot more to cover. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to talk about top change management strategies. This is a session, sort of a monologue that I had on the podcast not too long ago, where I talk about some of the top change management strategies you should be considering or deploying for your digital transformation. And then after that, we'll have Kate Arndt on the show, and she's going to be on talking about AI and change management. So a lot more to cover. We'll be back with more Transformation Ground Control.
If you are involved in any sort of digital transformation or business change initiative, you will want to download the Digital Transformation Report. With its comprehensive overview of business and technology trends and best practices, this report is a must-have guide for any transformation project or executive team. Download this free report by visiting Third Stage Consulting at thirdstage-consulting.com. You can also visit our website to learn more about us or download independent reports, videos, and other best practices. Again, visit thirdstage-consulting.com today to learn how you can take your transformation to the third stage of success.
I want to invite you to join me and other thought leaders in the digital transformation space to Stratosphere 2025. It's an annual conference we've hosted now for 7 years in a row. It's a great event. It's live in Denver, Colorado, but we're also offering it virtually via hybrid tickets. And we're going to have a lot of different speakers here, including myself as a keynote, as well as others that you may know from the industry. And this is a perfect conference if you're interested in any sort of digital transformation, including ERP and CRM and HCM. And actually, the theme for this year's session is AI and how AI is affecting all different types of digital transformation. But in addition to AI, we'll also talk about the fundamentals of digital transformation, including program management, evaluating the right software, digital strategy, change management, process improvement, all the things you need to know to make your project successful. It's also a great way to network and learn from others. So just being part of a community that is also like-minded and going through the same things you are, that's another value. And you can join, like I said, remotely in person, and you can also buy VIP tickets if you'd like more exclusive access to me and others from the Third Stage team and other speakers that are going to be there. So I hope to see you soon. Check out my discount code below for discounted tickets. You can go to stratosphere2025.com for more information, including the full agenda, and I hope to see you there.
Are you looking for ways to promote your product or service to enterprise technology decision makers and influencers throughout the world, like the ones who listen to this podcast? Major Tom Productions creates media, events, and influencer marketing for B2B technology providers. Our productions are exciting, educational, disruptive, and effective. Most importantly, they create results. Our content is unlike any other in this industry, engaging, influential, and trusted by technology buyers and influencers throughout the world. Each month, our productions reach hundreds of thousands of targeted buyers and decision makers who trust and engage with our honest and tech-agnostic content. With long-tail viral results and engagement with our content, Major Tom Productions provides a way to reach your target market and create awareness, calls to action, and a connection with potential customers. So collaborate with us today. Learn how we can feature your product or service on podcasts such as Transformation Ground Control, Journey to S4HANA, and Journey to Dynamics 365. We can also feature your brand on our YouTube channel called Digital Transformation with Eric Kimberling, which boasts over 100,000 subscribers and over 2 million video views per year. You can also participate in our in-person events, including our Digital Stratosphere Conference. Contact us today to learn more. We can tailor a marketing campaign that works for you. We look forward to helping more people learn more about and become engaged with your brand.
I'm gonna leave it all out there tonight. I'm gonna leave it all out there.
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 226. My name is Eric Kimberling. You can find new episodes of this show every Wednesday by going to transformationgroundcontrol.com. And the show is produced by Major Tom Productions and sponsored by Third Stage Consulting, which is an independent tech-agnostic consulting firm that helps clients throughout the world with their digital transformation journeys, including their change management efforts and their change management strategies. And speaking of change management strategies, I want to roll you this clip where I talk with a live audience about top change management strategies. And I talk a lot about some of the universal success factors for making your change strategies more successful. When we look at failed projects, when we help clients recover from their project failures, or if we're helping assess a project that's off track and we're trying to help them course correct and get the project back on track, or in some even more extreme cases, when we're hired as expert witnesses for lawsuits, which is one of the practices within our firm. One of the things we find in all three of those situations is that change management is typically one of the root causes for why the project is off track or why the project has failed or is failing. And so that's one of, if not the most common pattern we see with project failures is there's usually an inordinate amount of effort and cost and resources dedicated to the technology and building stuff. But there's usually an underinvestment in the people side of change, including the adoption, the communication, defining people's roles and responsibilities, all sorts of things related to change management. I'm going to cover some of that here today in terms of defining some of that methodology or talking through it with you here. Before I jump in, though, I'd love to hear from the audience what you think the biggest change issues are in initiatives you've been involved with, or maybe that you are involved with right now. Love to hear from you in the chat. What are those biggest challenges that you see from a people perspective, based on your experience? Is it getting to learn how to use the technology? Is it communicating? Is it alignment? What is it that you see as the biggest challenge? I'd love to hear your comments and thoughts here. Again, instead of having a guest here today, we thought that you guys would be the guest here in the audience to provide some of the feedback and thought leadership that we're going to cover here today. So I'd love to hear that in the chat. And here's already getting some interesting comments. One of the responses to that question is from Craig on LinkedIn. Says the change saturation is the biggest challenge that he's seen in his career. I couldn't agree more. Change saturation is a big deal, especially in this sort of post-COVID world here in the 2020s. Organizations are going through a ton of change as it is. And then when you throw a digital or a ERP project on top of change that was already happening, typically you've got a fatigued workforce that's oftentimes doesn't have the brain space or the capacity to embrace or dive into the change and support the change as effectively as they might otherwise. So change saturation is a real thing. And I think that's a great point that often gets overlooked, and I think one of the things you have to do as an organization too is recognize when you are experiencing change saturation or change fatigue, and not to say you should stop changing because you have to keep moving forward, but instead what it means is you might recast your plan or define a strategy that accounts for the fact that you've got change saturation or change fatigue. And I think that's where companies oftentimes get into trouble, is they take this overly optimistic rose-colored glass view of their project. They get these proposals from software vendors or technical implementers that are overly optimistic, and they assume that their organization can adapt as fast as what the outside third parties might suggest. And you as an organization have to figure out, is that realistic for us given where we are on the change saturation curve? So great point there. Another interesting response here from Daniel on LinkedIn. Says that lack of leadership alignment is number one. And I actually agree with that. I think leadership alignment is a tricky one because if you don't have it, it's really hard to, if not impossible, to succeed. And in the word alignment, I think a lot of times people, it's sort of ambiguous or people aren't 100% clear what that means. But when we talk about leadership alignment, what we mean is the leadership team on the same page in terms of having a clear understanding of not only where the organization is headed, but how this digital or ERP initiative is going to support that direction. And that connection of the dots, or that connecting the dots, is oftentimes where leadership teams get misaligned, because they might, even if they have a clear vision of where the organization is headed, what often ends up happening is they don't agree on or have a realistic understanding of what it's going to take from a digital transformation or ERP software perspective to support those change initiatives or those goals. And oftentimes, even worse, leadership teams don't see how, or they don't connect the dots themselves between the digital transformation project and the overall goals and objectives. And when you have that sort of leadership misalignment or disconnect, what ends up happening is the rest of the organization who's responsible for executing on the digital transformation oftentimes ends up totally misaligned. So they don't have a clear sense of how to support the project or how to execute the project in a way that supports the bigger picture goals and objectives of the organization. So that's why taking the time to make sure that your leadership team is on the same page with not only where you're headed as an organization, which most of the time when we work with clients, the leadership team has a good understanding and pretty strong alignment around the general direction of the company. But where the breakdown happens is when you start to introduce a new ERP system, you get into the mindset of, well, that's different. That's a technology initiative. That's not necessarily related to our strategic goals and objectives. Or if they do have a clear understanding of how the digital or ERP project can support those goals and objectives, the details of how that digital transformation project will support it oftentimes gets lost. And I'll give you an example. A lot of times when we go into new clients, speaking of this whole leadership alignment topic, when we go into new clients, what ends up happening a lot is they'll have a clear vision on the surface of the executives. That is, the executives will have a clear vision on the surface of what it is they want to accomplish with the digital transformation. So it might be something like, we want to have a single operating model. We want to consolidate our operations, standardize our operations, act like one company. We've gone out and acquired a bunch of companies over the years, and we're acting like a bunch of siloed organizations. We want to start acting like one organization. And that's a very clear vision at a high level. But when it comes to executing on a digital transformation, you have to make sure that the digital transformation supports that and is aligned with that goal. Because what often happens is executives have that vision at the top level, but then you get down to the next layer of the organization that's managing a digital transformation, and they go off track. They end up doing something different than supporting that common operating model, a standardization example that I'm giving here. And oftentimes it's because, again, the executives don't necessarily get involved enough, or they don't connect the dots between that high-level strategy and what this digital transformation means. The other thing that happens too is oftentimes, even if you get to that point where, in my example, where digital transformation project team understands that standardization is the goal, we want to act like one company, the pushback from the rest of the organization oftentimes overrides that, and you end up sort of veering off track if you don't keep that executive involvement and sort of oversight on the project. So great point, Daniel, on the lack of leadership alignment. That's a really important one that oftentimes gets overlooked. And oftentimes too, a lot of the other change management issues that you experience in a project can actually be traced back to that root cause, which is your organization's not aligned. It's creating all these other symptoms that you're trying to attack from a change management perspective. But if you don't get to that root cause of lack of leadership alignment, that's a real problem. So that's why we always suggest that if you're in the midst of a digital transformation or ERP project, and your leadership team is not aligned, then you want to make sure you get aligned, because that's where a lot of the root causes come from. And if you take the time to get aligned up front, make sure you're all on the same page, you have clear direction and clear articulation of how this project is going to support the overall goals and objectives, that time you take up front is actually going to speed things up a lot more later, versus the organizations that just jump right in without the alignment. They just jump in and start implementing technology. That's where organizations get into trouble. Some other interesting responses here. Alex on LinkedIn says process documentation and lack of a user acceptance test. That's an interesting one. I think that sort of touches on a really important thing that sort of aligns with or builds on the last point we were just talking about with executive alignment and leadership alignment. Along those same lines, part of that, when I think of executive alignment, I also think of clarity of what the future state is going to be. And that ties into process documentation. So not that the executive team necessarily needs to be building out process documentation and conducting user acceptance testing, but what they do need to do is have at least some strong involvement in helping define or at least approving what that future state operational model is going to look like in those future state business processes. And once you have that clarity of vision, obviously you need to document it too, so that you have a blueprint to build the new technology on. What ends up, one of the unhealthy dynamics of digital transformations and ERP projects in general, is that you get software vendors that say, don't worry about your process documentation. We'll do that for you because our software will sort of determine how your processes are going to operate in that future state. And if you think about business processes as sort of a hierarchy, you've got the high level macro processes all the way down to, on the other extreme, all the way down to the granular detail of what buttons you push, what menu options you choose, what fields you enter, all that stuff. Those are two extremes. And the technology is going to help you define that bottom level extreme, the details of how a button gets pushed, what fields you fill out, all that stuff. But there's a million different ways to configure software to conduct even the simplest business processes. So if you don't have that clarity of vision of what you want your business processes to look like at those higher levels, then you end up shooting in the dark and deferring to the software to a fault, to where you aren't able to make decisions of what you want your business processes to look like. And so you end up defaulting to whatever standard configuration the software vendor is used to, or whatever may or may not work for your organization. But that's one of the tricky things, is you want to make sure you have that clearly defined business processes as a sort of a blueprint to how you're going to deploy and configure technology, and ultimately how you're going to test it as well. And that should all tie back to your business processes, which should then, the business processes should also tie back to your executive leadership and your executive direction and goals and objectives as an organization. So great point there. Interesting comment here from Alog on YouTube. Says that worries about the future are the number one concern from a people perspective. And I'd be curious to hear more about what you mean by that. But I think what you mean is that people within the organization worry about the future and what's going to happen in the organization, what's going to happen to their job, the sort of fears of the unknown. And what happens a lot too is organizations at the beginning of a project see that the employee base and the workforce is pretty excited about the idea of going through a digital transformation or new ERP system, especially if you're using really old systems that are broken and inefficient, hard to use, all that stuff. And you're talking about moving to a modern cloud-based technology with a real sexy user interface, all that stuff. People can get excited about that. You want to build on that momentum and obviously enable that excitement. But what ends up happening inevitably is you start to hit a bunch of headwinds organizationally when you actually get into the implementation. Because now it's not just a vision of excitement and what could be. Now it's getting into the details of how your job is going to change and how you're going to be threatened in a lot of ways, especially when you look at some of these new technologies like artificial intelligence and robotic process automation and things that disrupt people's jobs and materially change their jobs, even if it's for the better for the organization and even better for that person individually. Longer term, short term, is going to create challenges and headwinds, and people do worry. And in general, even the most well-intentioned people within an organization are going to resist change because they either don't understand the future. And that's usually the biggest thing, by the way, with organizations, is they don't clearly define for the organization and the people in the organization what their future state is. They'll talk about technology all day, but they won't talk about or articulate for the organization what those people are going to be doing, how their job's going to look. They talk about all these great things like saving time and money, automating processes. But oftentimes what people hear is, well, you're automating the job that I've been doing for the same way for 20 years. So what's going to happen to my job? And if you don't provide that clarity of what's going to happen to their job and how they're going to do things differently, and get them comfortable with that, then they're gonna resist the change, and that's where organizations don't think enough about that piece of it. So worries about the future is a great one. This is an interesting comment from Pruthov on LinkedIn. He says cloud ERPs are facing the same challenges as legacy ERPs. I totally agree with that. I think that the potential business benefits or potential advantages of cloud ERP over legacy is overstated, in my opinion. There certainly is value, of course, in terms of infrastructure and cost savings and things like that, consistent updates, things of that nature. But when it comes to actually implementation itself, there's really not a big difference. I'd say it's a wash, a net neutral advantage of cloud ERP over legacy ERP, because the good thing with legacy ERP is you could configure it and customize it to a fault. You could tailor it to fit exactly what people wanted. Now with cloud ERP, you've got a lot less flexibility. You're forcing a certain amount of standardization, which makes change more difficult. And again, longer term, that might be the right answer. There might be a ton of ROI in that, and there usually is for organizations. But in the short term, when you're going through the implementation, it's a lot of the same challenges, in terms of how you implement ERP systems and the change management aspects of it, as well as a lot of the technical stuff too. When you go through a cloud ERP deployment, you still have to do a lot of the same things you had to do with a legacy implementation. So you're not saving a ton of time and money by deploying cloud ERPs. In fact, in some cases, organizations struggle more with cloud ERP implementations than they did with legacy, because of that limited flexibility and some of the other things we talk about. So great point there. Got a couple questions coming in too. So let's shift gears, and I'll actually take some of the questions here from the audience. This is from Kyler on LinkedIn. Kyler says, what was your response to a vendor saying we will handle OCM? Great question. We hear this a lot with software vendors within our clients, where software vendor will discuss and pitch their change management services. And typically the change management from a software vendor or even a big system integrator or technical implementer, typically when they talk about change management or when they discuss change management, it's from a software training perspective. And if you think about it, that makes sense of what they would be good at. They're good at teaching people how to use a technology because they're technologists and they're experts in the technology. And by the way, even in that case, though, they're typically training the trainers within your organization, and then you're responsible. The trainers within your own organization are responsible for going out and training. So even within the narrow part of training, the software training, the software vendor typically falls short of what the bigger picture is that's going to be required. Not to mention the fact, more importantly, that change management, and to be effective in change management, requires a lot more than just software training. So in other words, you need to be able to take more than just teaching people how to use software. You have to work through all the process changes that are happening, just so people understand how their new world is going to look, what their roles and responsibilities are going to be within those new processes. And the technology is more of a capstone. It's when you get to software training, that's usually the capstone that happens shortly before go live. But there's a bunch of stuff that leads up to that needs to get done. And most organizations skip that other stuff. And when they skip that other stuff, what happens is you get to end user training. And even if you do end user training flawlessly, you execute it flawlessly, what's going to happen if you haven't done other change management stuff is the freak out moments that I call them, which is a semi-technical term. Those freak out moments will happen in your end user training. That's when people start to panic and say, oh my gosh, you're completely changing my business processes. This is totally different than the way I do things today. Why is this part of my job going away? Why is this part of my job being added to my responsibility? And oftentimes what it does is it creates more anxiety, more fear and doubt when you get to that end user training, because you haven't done all the legwork leading up to it. And so that's why you have to spend a lot of time before end user training, which is what the software vendors are good at. Someone, which is usually not your software vendor, has to do all that other stuff foundationally to get people ready for the end user training, so that the end user training becomes sort of a non-event. It's more of a formality of, I already understand my process. I already understand my roles and responsibilities. I already had my freak out moments. I worked through my freak out moments. Now I'm just here to learn how the technology, at a detailed level, is going to help me do the things I already know I have to do. if that makes sense. So you need to make sure you've got, organizational design and definition of roles and responsibilities, a lot of communication that leads up. And when I say communication, I'm not talking about just project newsletters and updates on, we're going live in 6 weeks, go team. It's more targeted communications to make sure people understand what's happening, what the changes are, why the changes are happening, how it's going to affect individuals and work groups within the organization, and ultimately what's in it for me, as a either an individual and or a work group within an organization. So really important stuff to make sure that we complete a complete change, that we define and execute a complete change management plan, which again is typically not handled by your software vendor. Software vendor should be involved, obviously, in the training piece of it. But even that isn't enough to execute a full training program. Typically, you need more support than what a software vendor can typically handle. And certainly outside the realm of training, there's a lot more that needs to happen. So great question there. Here's an interesting question from Alex on LinkedIn. Alex says, also, when converting from a manual to more automated process, folks losing control or protection of data they previously had in a file cabinet or on their spreadsheet on their desktop Great point. I mean, you do, what ends up happening in these sorts of projects that's really important to recognize from a sort of a human and organizational psychology perspective is that there's something that, in most cases, there's something that someone's losing, even if the net benefit is great. So in other words, if I'm an employee that's been at the organization for 25 years and I sort of built and mastered this elaborate process to manage my world, and it's based on a lot of my tribal knowledge and understanding of how things work around here. If you come in and tell me you're going to automate that, or you're going to centralize that data, you're going to take away that spreadsheet, you're going to take away, or you're going to centralize that tribal knowledge that I have in my head right now, what ends up happening is now suddenly I move from a position of pride and heroics where I'm making stuff happen. I created this process. The systems we have are broken, but yet because of my fortitude or my intuition or my strengths, I'm able to execute those processes anyway. Now the sense of heroics and that the pride that people have is suddenly at risk, because now where am I going to take pride, and how am I going to be valued by the organization if you're not so dependent on my tribal knowledge, or you're not so dependent on my spreadsheet that I created and mastered and fine-tuned over 25 years. So those are the types of things you have to think about. Is it's not that in the case of me as an example, it's not that I want to sabotage the organization or that I don't want to be a team player, I don't want to support the organization. That's usually not it. It's usually because I worry that what you're doing is you're taking away the things that I'm good at. So that's something that's really important to keep in mind as well. Here's an interesting question. I actually don't know that I'm gonna have a good answer for this, but I'd love to turn it to the audience because I think it's a really interesting one that I haven't heard before. This is from Lalita on YouTube. And Lalita says, hi all, what impact do you think the digitalization of companies will have with current and future geopolitical decisions in the short term? And maybe we could broaden that and say, you've got political and geopolitical, macroeconomic. There's a lot of external forces that could affect decisions in the short term, especially as it relates to digital transformations and ERP implementations. I don't know that I have a good answer. I'd love to hear the audience's questions. I'd love to hear the audience's thoughts on that question. So if you've got, some opinions on that, I'd love to hear it, because I don't know that I have a good answer on that, but I do think it's something that's very real, especially with, multiple wars happening in the world right now, economic uncertainty, economic ups and downs within the world, labor shortages. There's a lot of these sort of external factors that inevitably will affect and impact digital transformations. I think, one thing I'll say from my perspective that I see as the leader of our company at Third Stage is that I think what's happening is a lot of organizations are becoming more cautious in how they move forward. Right after COVID, when all the lockdowns happened and everything, there was this sort of urgency to move now, almost to a fault, where companies were just moving really quickly without necessarily doing the proper planning and having a solid strategy behind it. But they were moving quick. And now what's happening is a lot of that urgency has seemed to cool off and sort of shifted a bit to where organizations are being more cautious, more uncertain, more hesitant in terms of moving forward with these big projects. And I don't know if it's the change fatigue that we were talking about earlier, because we have gone through a lot of change as a workforce and as a business world and as a human race, I should say, in the last 3 or 4 years. So it could be that the change fatigue is catching up. It could be that spending is slowing down just because the companies have spent so much and changed so much in the last couple of years. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on that from the audience here. What are your thoughts on how geopolitical things might affect transformations and technology in the short term? Here's an interesting comment from Sandeep on YouTube. Sandeep, this is in response to my question earlier about what the most important change or the most challenging change dimension is within a transformation. Sandeep says that deviating from allocated budgets hampers digital transformation success, and midway executive leadership changes disrupt significant digital transformation initiatives. Great point there. If you deviate from budget or go over budget or have a leadership change, that's going to create problems along the way. I'd also add that a lot of times organizations will have some sort of big business change along the way where, it could be a merger or acquisition, or like Sandeep said, you could have executive turnover. You could be, opening a new plant or expanding into a new market. And that's the thing with transformations that you have to be aware of, is that you're going to go through this 1, 2, 3 or more year initiative. And during that time, your organization isn't, nor should it, stand still. It's not going to stand still while you're going through the project. You're still going to run your business. You're still going to make strategic decisions, and you're gonna pivot along the way. And what's important is that you make sure that your digital transformation stays aligned with that as things do change, and that you have some buffer within your plan and strategy to account for the fact that some stuff might happen that you're not aware of, whether it's internal dynamics like a leadership change or a merger or acquisition, or if it's something external like a macroeconomic change or the geopolitical aspects, wars, things of that nature that we just talked about. So great point there. I'm here chatting about change strategies you should be considering as part of your digital strategy. We've got a lot more to cover in this conversation, but first we're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back with more Transformation Ground Control. Hi, this is Eric Kimberling with Third Stage Consulting and your host of Transformation Ground Control. I want to encourage you to read our Guide to Organizational Change Management. It's a free report or free guide that we published. It's one that I actually wrote that talks about best practices and lessons learned as it relates to change management. So as you know, on this podcast, we cover a lot of stuff related to the human sides of change, organizational change management, including training, communications, org design, all kinds of stuff as it relates to change management. So if you're trying to learn more about change management, or you're looking for more direction and ideas on how to get started on your change management strategy and your overall journey, be sure to check out this guide. You can read it by scanning the QR code on the screen in front of you, or in the links below for this particular podcast episode. You can find a link to take you to the page that will allow you to register to go ahead and download that and read it for free. So be sure to check it out. It's the Guide to Organizational Change Management, written by yours truly. I hope you enjoy it. Let me know what you think, and hope you enjoy the rest of this episode. People oftentimes ask me how I built such a strong social media following on YouTube and LinkedIn and Facebook and other outlets. And the fact of the matter is it took me a long time to build a following through a lot of trial and error, making a lot of mistakes. Had I known that there were companies out there that could help me build my brand, I would have done that a long time ago. I didn't know that, but the good news is that there is today a consulting firm that will help you through building your own personal brand through some of their training programs. The company is called Roloff Consulting, and if you're familiar with Emma Roloff, she's someone that I've had on this podcast before, and she's well known in the digital transformation space as well as the sales space, and she's big on TikTok, YouTube, and LinkedIn. And she and her husband have started a training course and a training company that focuses on helping people build their personal brands and helping them to sell themselves digitally. So whether you're a salesperson that's trying to reach more customers, or you're an individual that's just trying to build your personal brand, that's something that they help with through their training programs. And they've offered listeners of this podcast a free 5-day LinkedIn challenge. And I encourage you to check it out. I've included a link below for this podcast. If you go to the podcast notes, you'll find a link that gets you free access to this 5-day challenge where you'll get step-by-step guidance. You'll get real results. So you'll get some tangible results from the program. And you also get a special offer at the end of it. So it's exclusive to listeners of this podcast. Be sure to check out the link below if you want to work on building your personal brand, or if you're in sales and you're trying to reach more people. Whatever the case may be, check it out. It's free to listeners of this podcast. You can check it out via the link below.
Roman cavalry choirs are singing. Be my mirror, my sword and shield, my missionaries in a foreign
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 226. My name is Eric Kimberling. You can find new episodes of this show every Wednesday by going to transformationgroundcontrol.com. This show is sponsored by Third Stage Consulting, an independent and tech-agnostic consulting firm that helps clients throughout the world with their digital transformation and change management journeys. So I'm here talking about, or playing you a clip where I was talking about the top change management strategies that you should be considering for your ERP implementation. Let's jump back into the conversation. There's a question from Dennis on LinkedIn. Dennis says, how can change management practices focus on employee well-being? And that's a great point. And I know well-being is sort of, it's becoming more and more important in today's HR and human capital management world. And certainly from a change management perspective, we have to be focused on that. One thing I'd say at the risk of potentially oversimplifying is that my knee-jerk reaction to this is that if you do change management well, you are focusing on their well-being. And if you think about what causes employees, especially during times of change and turmoil, what causes them to not have a high level of well-being is a lot of the stuff we've been talking about: the fear, anxiety, the stress, the chaos, the change fatigue. Those things undermine employee well-being. So if you can, as simple as it may sound, if you can stop doing the things that undermine employee well-being, that's a great first step. And that's where most organizations fall short, is they unintentionally do things, or I should say they don't do things that are inevitably going to create stress and internal conflict within the organization. So again, if we get back to that example of, if we don't do a full change strategy and full change plan leading up to end user training, when by the time you get to end user training and then your go live, that is not good for employee well-being when they haven't had any sort of time to digest or understand these new processes and why the changes are happening and how the organization is going to be affected, or how their jobs are going to be affected by it, what their specific roles and responsibilities are, being involved in making sure that the system actually works and getting comfortable with it. All those things, if we don't do those things, which most organizations don't, then now we've got a situation where employee well-being is at risk. So I think the biggest thing you can do is just make sure you do the things you need to do to have an effective change strategy. It's not going to make things, it's not going to be the optimal highest peak of well-being, because you're going through change and it's going to be difficult for people no matter what. But what you can do is be realistic, first of all, to understand that you're not going to reach that state of utopia anytime soon, right after go live. It's going to be somewhat stressful, somewhat chaotic, somewhat uncertain, but you want to minimize that as much as you can. And the way you do that is through effective change management. So great question there, or great question there, Dennis. And one thing I want to share with you too, I'm actually going to share a quick slide real quick, just as a visual here. This is from a change management presentation that our team and I will often give during different client situations. And one thing that is interesting and fascinating to me, that I've really become somewhat obsessed with over recent years of having done change management for so long, is that a lot of times when we think of change resistance, people think of sort of that intentional resistance. They think of, they're looking for that person that wants to sabotage the project, or that's shaking their head and saying, no, I'm not going to do it. I don't want to learn these new processes. I don't want to support the change. I don't want to get involved, that sort of thing. And the interesting part of change management, the tricky part of change management, and the misleading part of change management, is that most people are not like that. I'd say within most organizations, 95% or more are not like that. They're not trying to sabotage the project. They're not openly against the project. I'd say 95% or more of employees that we work with, at least with clients, they mean well. They want to support the project. They oftentimes are genuinely excited about the project. But where the tricky part happens is it's the unintentional resistance. It's all these little gotchas these little things that are hard to detect and anticipate. And so what happens is organizations go into a project. If you think of it as like an excitement curve, you go into a project, you start assessing potential technologies, you get alignment and agree on what kind of technology you're going to deploy. You see the vision of how the organization could look in the future, and that curve goes up. You've got a lot of excitement and momentum behind the project. But then things start to drop off. That's as good as it gets. I hate to say it, but it's as good as it gets when you've picked the technology and you've gotten an agreement from the organization that, yes, we're going to move forward. We're going to go implement whatever technology or technologies it is. That's usually the peak level of excitement. From there, it starts to drop off because now you're getting into the realities and the headwinds of change. You're starting to change processes. You're starting to see how your processes don't fit the technology and how the technology doesn't fit the processes the way you want it, or it's not ideal. That's all normal stuff. So that's when excitement starts to drop and wane. And if you don't manage that, that can tank really fast, and it can actually tank the entire project. So you have to look at that unintentional resistance and understand and anticipate that even if people are excited right now on the day we're deciding to move forward with this project, I, as an executive, am going to look around, I'm going to see a bunch of excited people, and I'm going to be misled and fooled into thinking that change management is not going to be that important, or it's not going to be that difficult for us. Maybe for other organizations, but I'm looking around at my people right now. They're super excited. They want this change. They understand why we need it. In fact, they're pushing for it. So let's not worry about change management. And that's a huge mistake because it creates this blind spot, because it's that unintentional resistance that has yet to come. It's coming later. It's coming during the project. You just don't see it yet. But it's like that tip of the iceberg. You see a little, maybe a tiny little bit of resistance. You see that, occasional person or two that you can tell are openly opposed. They're actually not the problem because they're easier to detect. I'd almost rather have someone who's openly trying to sabotage a project, because then you can kind of target your change efforts a little bit more. But the problem is underneath the iceberg, there's a huge layer of unknown, unintentional resistance. And that's where it gets back to what I was saying before. People are afraid of what they don't know. They're afraid of the loss and the uncertainty and the things that they don't fully understand in terms of how their jobs are going to change, what the roles are going to look like, all that good stuff. So there's also not fully understanding a process and how it works. And what's even worse is when an organization says they're going to automate X% of someone's job, but they haven't figured out or defined what's going to happen with that X% of the job that got automated. So if 30% of my job is now automated because I don't have to do dual entry or spend all my time looking up data, because now I have a system that has it all right in front of me, what am I going to do at that time? And if you don't tell me what I'm going to do at that time, I'm going to get nervous, because I'm going to think, well, what are you going to do with me? Are you going to get rid of me? Do you need me? You start to question your own value to the organization. So that unintentional resistance, the misunderstanding are both very important. And then on the far right side of the slide, you see that misalignment is the other form of resistance. And that's where, what we talked about before, the executive team is not aligned, or the rest of the organization is not aligned with the executive team, or the future state is not well defined. We haven't gotten alignment on what our future state business processes are. When you have that level of misalignment, that creates resistance. And it's not because the employees don't see the value in the project or in what's happening with the project, but it's because they don't understand, and they're not on the same page, and it's not clear to the organization what direction they're going. So all important stuff there. So great questions here, and more continue to come in here. There's a follow-up comment from Susmitha. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Susmitha on LinkedIn. It says, very true. Heading into change with an assumption of intentional resistance also leads to a closed mindset approach to change and lack of listening. And that's a really good point. I think, the key word is listening. I mean, you really have to listen to and dive into an organization and the culture of the organization to understand and recognize where the challenges are gonna come. And what we do as a team at Third Stage when we're consulting to organizations is, even in cases where organizations are saying, yeah, I know change management's important for everyone else, but for us, it's not going to be a big deal because everyone's excited and we don't see anything below the tip of the iceberg. What we do in those cases, or any case for that example, is we'll do an organizational assessment that doesn't necessarily try to answer the question, is your organization ready for change? Because the answer is mixed. Usually it's yes right now, but you're not going to be, once you get into the change. That's not a good enough assessment to be able to come out with that. So what we do is we dive into not answering the question of, is your organization ready for change? But we go layers deeper to look at what are the things within your culture and your organization that are going to cause resistance to change as the project evolves. So for example, if you have if you do this change assessment and you find that there's a perceived lack of coordination and communication between departments, that is going to create challenges later, because now, as when you're looking at, say, an ERP system, you're looking at integrated end-to-end processes that affect everyone upstream and downstream as well as yourselves. So you have to start to act more integrated and more collaborative and have a better understanding of upstream and downstream processes. So in that case, you might spend more time, in the case of the organization that is perceived to have lack of coordination and lack of communication between departments, you might recognize, okay, we need to spend more time up front defining end-to-end processes. We need to do that anyway, right? To define our future state processes so that we have a blueprint to build the technology. But we're actually going to spend a little bit more time than we need to for the software vendor to help our team get on the same page. So this is where, again, software vendor proposal and plan versus organizational needs are misaligned. Software vendor doesn't necessarily need you to get on the same page to build the software. They just need to know what's the process going to look like. But you as an organization need to understand, how are we going to integrate our teams? How are we going to ensure that everyone's on the same page? And that's going to take longer than what the software vendor needs. And that's where a delay happens. So right there, you have a decision you have to make. Do we do what the software vendor says, which is we can do this in a compressed time frame because they just need the answer of what's the business process? Or do we do it the way that's going to take longer, but do we do it the way that helps us as an organization ensure that we address that fact that there's a lack of coordination and communication between departments? And by taking a little bit longer on our business process work up front, even though the software vendor didn't need us to, we took a little bit longer, but we're addressing a change management problem and challenge. And those are the types of things you have to think about as you're defining your project plan. Because if you base your project plan based on sort of a myopic view of technology deployment, you're going to end up inevitably with a project plan that's not realistic. It's going to underestimate the amount of time and money and resource commitment and risk than what is real. And so you have to do this organizational assessment to be able to have a pretty decent or an effective change strategy there. So here's a interesting question or a comment from William on YouTube. William says, yes, people are excited about a project until they have to do something they don't like or give up some measure of control. So great comment. Couldn't agree more. There's a lot of control that you give up as an employee, especially if you're not part of the core project team. When we're on a project team, you have to think about it from this perspective too. If you or I, or all of us here on this discussion here today, if we're all part of a project team, we have the luxury of being in the driver's seat. We're making decisions. We're heavily involved, so we don't struggle with the same things that the rest of the organization is going to struggle with, because we know what's going on. We've made in many cases, we've made the decisions. We've been actively involved. We see the freight train coming, but to employees, they have no idea what's coming, and so you have to sort of overcorrect for that and make sure that you're painfully transparent at times. And it's hard to do because when you're on a project team, you're just heads down trying to get through all these moving parts and all the complexities of a project. But you have to look outward to the rest of the organization to say, we need to get everyone else somewhat caught up to where we are. They're never going to be as comfortable as we are because we're on the project team. We're knee deep in it every day. Every hour of our working days is focused on this, whereas the rest of the organization sort of running their business, doing their day jobs, and they're more likely to be surprised. So that a lot of this is about control. How do you ensure that people don't feel like they're losing too much control during a project? And as technology changes, by the way, exponentially, as it changes faster and faster, this phenomenon becomes even more important, because now technology is changing faster than it did 10 years ago or 20 years ago. But our ability to change as humans has not kept up with the pace of change with technology. And so we have to recognize that and know that, our organization, especially if we're a mature, well-established organization, a big, complex organization, we are just not going to be able to move as fast. We're going to try, we're going to change, It's just going to take us longer than the technology is going to change. So that's an important point. I want to come back to the organizational readiness piece and how to anticipate proactively what the potential resistance might be. One of the things we do, as I started to go down this path, but I didn't really finish the thought because I got hung up on an example. But, we look within an organization, when we do an organizational assessment, we're looking for the dimensions of a culture or an organization that are likely to create resistance to change later. So I gave the example a moment ago of the organization that is perceived to not collaborate or communicate across departments. That's one thing we look for. So we look at communication style of an organization. We look at leadership style. We look at perceptions of leadership. We look at accountability. What are people's perceptions of how accountable or not people hold each other? We look at people's perception of leadership. So what do people think of the leadership team? And so we're quantitatively and qualitatively measuring all these different dimensions of an organization. And inevitably what happens as an output is you get results from that assessment, quantitative and qualitatively, that leads you down a path of saying, okay, these are the things that are likely to cause change. These are the sort of the root causes that we know are going to be a challenge or that we can start to address now so that we can hopefully anticipate and overcome some of those changes before they actually materialize. So that's something that is worth noting too, is you want to make sure that that you have that piece of it addressed. And then once you've done that too, by the way, once you've done the organizational assessment, then what you do is you create a plan that's built on the results of that assessment. So those are just a few sort of add-on points I wanted to address there along those lines too. I also want to show you, just sort of rounding out this whole picture of what change management is and the things that you should be doing to address change management. This is a slide just looking through sort of the change management objectives and the things that you should accomplish or do as part of a change management effort to make it successful. And this is not a complete list. There's other things that you want to make sure you do within this, but these are some of the high level dimensions that we want to make sure we address. So here's where we look at, organizational readiness is what I was just talking about at the top left. We talked about alignment of executives and stakeholders. I'm just kind of moving top row left to right, and I won't go through everything, but sort of work our way down. So we talked about assessing organizational readiness, aligning executives and stakeholders. We also want to mobilize internal change agents, and those are the people that are going to actually go back to the organization and start to communicate changes and do the two-way communication, capture concerns from the organization, share what the changes are. And usually those change agents are part of the team. They're shoulder to shoulder with the frontline people. And so they become the people that are sort of the conduit or the connection between the project team and the core change management team and the rest of the organization. So they're the ones that can sort of speak the language of both the project team and the day-to-day frontline employees. You want to develop and execute a communications plan, assess and deploy change impacts. That's a big deal. When you look at how someone's job is going to change, how a business process is going to change, you want to define what the change impacts are and start to communicate that as soon as you can, so that you can, again, work through those freak out moments now. If your go live is, say, 9 months from now, and you can start to get people to freak out and work through it now, you might as well do it now instead of waiting 8 months right before go live. Start working through that now so that by the time you get to end user training, they've already freaked out, they've calmed down, they kind of get it, they understand. Now it's just a matter of show me how to use the technology to do the things you already told me I'm going to do. So that's part of what the change impacts are and what's so important there. You want to design and deploy organizational changes. And a lot of times too, by the way, you start to make process and organizational changes that you don't need to wait till go live. If you can start sort of spoon feeding and incrementally implementing process changes, procedural changes, organizational changes, start to shift roles around, that sort of thing. If you can do that now while you're implementing, that's ideal, because then you're sort of speeding up the change management and you're not waiting until day one of go live to spring all those changes all at once on everyone. So if you can design and deploy organizational changes throughout the implementation, that's another sort of parallel work stream that can actually speed things up quite a bit later on. So actually both those points, the organizational changes and the business process improvements, you can be doing those things early on. Anything you can do to build internal centers of excellence, to support the project, makes you less dependent on the technology vendors and that sort of thing. That's super important too. One of the other things that you'll see here is customizing ERP software training. So if you're deploying ERP software or any technology, you want to customize that training for your organization. Often, most of the time, most software vendors don't have time or the capacity or resources to create tailored training materials by industry and by, different types of configurations and things of that nature. So it's incumbent on you, the project team, to customize that training. And typically that is not included in a software vendor's proposal. Usually they're going to say, okay, we've got our boilerplate training materials. We're going to come train your team. Your team's going to go sort of translate that into your operational reality and go do it. Well, that takes a lot of time to customize that training so that if you're doing a training scenario, you don't, and let's just say you manufacture, high tech semiconductors, but the boilerplate training materials are using, building a bicycle or, building a widget as the example in the training material. That's not going to make sense to your organization. You need to see how you're going to build semiconductors and all the stuff that goes into that. And specific to how you're configuring that software and deploying that software and using that software. So customizing ERP software training is one of those really big hidden costs, and it's a really big part of the hidden iceberg of software implementation time, cost, resource, and risk. So that's a really important one. And then the last thing I'll say on this slide is the bottom few boxes are about sort of that implementation and post-implementation, where you focus on benefits realization and how to make sure that you are getting the most value out of the organization. Because too often organizations you sort of stop at go live. They stop, they did the training, they make sure that everyone's passed the training or whatever, make sure that people are actually able to survive and do their jobs, and then they move on to the next phase of the project. And what's really important is to recognize that you're not going to get optimal business benefits on day 1 or even day 30 or day 60. It's usually going to take several weeks or months to get people up to that optimal level. Not only because it takes them time to learn the system and get used to it, but also because you're going to want to make changes post-implementation. You're going to identify those things that weren't ideal during implementation. You might need to reconfigure some stuff. You might need to integrate some things that weren't integrated. You might need to clean up data. You might need to retrain people, do some refresher training, redefine a process, whatever. There's all these different things that you need to be doing. And that's just part of the normal process. You hope to work through most of that. But if you can do that earlier on, or do that is part of your go live strategy, that's going to be super important. So here's a follow-up question from a thread we were talking about earlier. We were talking about legacy versus cloud ERP, and this is from Eduardo on LinkedIn. Whoops, I just hid the question accidentally. There it is. So Eduardo says, if they can't handle legacy ERP, what difference does it make with cloud ERP? And I agree. If you had trouble, you as an organization didn't do well in your legacy ERP implementation, you can't nor should you assume that a cloud ERP is going to be easier if you do things the same way you did with a legacy system. You're going to have to, step up your game, if you will, to be more effective in your implementation, because it's a lot of the same. If you think about it, the process and people challenges are all the same. With cloud, the only difference is the way you deploy the technology is a little bit more, it's a lot more modern. It's a little bit easier. So that's something to keep in mind too. Follow up to the slide I just reviewed on the change management objectives. This is from Shilpi on LinkedIn. Shilpi says, love this comprehensive list of change management objectives. One other thing I'd add, in addition to change agents and train the trainers, is a community of practice. So great point. I don't know if you mean like center of excellence or a sort of that internal competency around certain processes or technologies. I'd be curious to see if, Shilpi, as a follow-up, if you don't mind, let me know what you mean by that, or clarifying if I'm off base in terms of what you're thinking. But I think it's a great point that you do want to build that center of excellence and ensure that you've got, you've got that addressed as part of your project. Here's a question again from Kyler on LinkedIn. This is, what about an executive team that isn't bought into the need for change management initiatives within a technical project? And that's a great question. And that is a difficult one because it's hard to change the mind of an executive team, especially if they haven't been through a project like this before. If they've been through a project like this before, chances are pretty high they're going to recognize the need for change management. But it's the organization and the executive team that is not familiar with how these projects typically work. That's the scary part, because it's hard to convince them, especially when they're looking around, seeing something totally different than what they might be hearing from someone like me or our team. So like I mentioned before, if you look around, your employees are all excited, they're on board, they're ready to go. It's hard if you've never been through it to see, like, where's the risk? What am I missing here? I hear this consultant doing a live discussion talking about it, but I'm not seeing it in my organization. And so that's where that change readiness assessment comes in, is if you can do that change readiness assessment, which is a very low cost, low effort, high value sort of a initiative. When you do that organizational assessment, that's typically where you'll find the results and the sort of the case for why change management is important. And more importantly, how specifically change management can and should be deployed within your organization. I think the problem with change management is it's such a broad, fuzzy word that a lot of executives don't fully understand what it means. So if you can redefine change management and define it in a way that's specific to your organization and what your needs are and what your culture is and your risk tolerance and all that stuff, then suddenly you're speaking the language of your executive team. So that's a great point. And so the org readiness assessment is probably the best way, or one of the best ways of making sure that your executives understand the importance of change. And of course, just educating them with content like this, discussions like this will help. But if they're not listening to this sort of content, to the podcast like this, or looking at our YouTube channels or my YouTube channel or any of the other content we put out there, then you're not gonna necessarily get their buy-in. Yeah, here's Shilpi's follow-up was an extension of the Center of Excellence, was her sort of clarification of what she meant by, I forgot what the word was she used. It was a knowledge center, I think is what the word was, but I think or a community of practice is the word she used originally. And it sounds like she's talking about an extension of the Center of Excellence. So, yeah, I think whether you call it Center of Excellence or community of practice or whatever, I think the important thing from the perspective of planning for this is to make sure that you are focused on building internal competencies. That's really what we're talking about here, is how to build those internal competencies. So great comments and great questions. So that was my conversation talking about top change management strategies. I hope you learned as much as I did from that conversation, just learning from the audience and answering some of the questions on the fly. It was a very good conversation. I enjoyed it. And hopefully you learned a lot there. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to talk about AI and change management. That's going to be with our third and final guest of the show, or fourth and final guest, I should say, because we had two guests in the first segment. But Kate Arndt is going to be on the show here in just a moment. But first, we're going to take a quick break. We'll be back with more Transformation Ground Control.
I'll give you anything to feel it coming. Do you wake up on your own? I wonder where.
I'm excited to announce the release of our 2025 Digital Transformation Report. It's available now on the Third Stage Consulting website, www.thirdstage-consulting.com. This report gives you an unbiased, technology-agnostic insight to help you optimize your organization's projects for success. Get your copy today using the QR code in front of me or on our website.
Are you looking for ways to promote your product or service to enterprise technology decision makers and influencers throughout the world, like the ones who listen to this podcast? Major Tom Productions creates media, events, and influencer marketing for B2B technology providers. Our productions are exciting, educational, disruptive, and effective. Most importantly, they create results. Our content is unlike any other in this industry, engaging, influential, and trusted by technology buyers and influencers throughout the world. Each month, our productions reach hundreds of thousands of targeted buyers and decision makers who trust and engage with our honest and tech-agnostic content. With long-tail viral results and engagement with our content, Major Tom Productions provides a way to reach your target market and create awareness, calls to action, and a connection with potential customers. So, collaborate with us today. Learn how we can feature your product or service on podcasts such as Transformation Ground Control, Journey to S4HANA, and Journey to Dynamics 365. We can also feature your brand on our YouTube channel called Digital Transformation with Eric Kimberling, which boasts over 100,000 subscribers and over 2 million video views per year. You can also participate in our in-person events, including our Digital Stratosphere Conference. Contact us today to learn more. We can tailor a marketing campaign that works for you. We look forward to helping more people learn more about and become engaged with your brand.
And I'll do anything you ever dreamed to be complete. Little pieces of the nothing that fall.
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 226. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent and tech-agnostic consulting firm that helps clients throughout the world with their digital transformation journeys. And recently I had Kate Arndt on the show to talk about AI and change management, how AI is affecting people and how people and change management in general can help enable AI adoption. So for those of you that are thinking about or starting on a journey to implement AI initiatives, this is a really good conversation for you. She's more of a manufacturing expert, supply chain and manufacturing expert. But even if you're not in the manufacturing and supply chain space, even though she gives some examples in those specific industries, the general concepts we talk about here are going to be relevant whatever industry you're in. So I look forward to sharing this with you. So here's my conversation with Kate talking about AI and change management. Before we jump in and just start diving into the topic at hand here, tell us a little bit about yourself and your role at Amgen.
Sure. So at Amgen, we are working really hard to prioritize implementing various technologies kind of across the organization. But my role at Amgen is to kind of focus on the manufacturing side of things and working with our alliance partners to integrate these new technologies into manufacturing in the most effective and beneficial way possible.
Great. Now you've been in the technology space for some time now. How did you end up in this space, and how did you sort of grow up and get to this role where you're at right now?
So I have a little bit of a, I guess, varied career. I studied industrial and manufacturing engineering in college, and then I went to ExxonMobil and basically sold industrial and automotive lubricants and greases. So that was a lot of exposure in the industrial space. I spent so much time, my whole career, in manufacturing, seeing it from different lenses. And I've always been obsessed with data, though, and I realized there's such an opportunity for manufacturers if they were to be able to access their data and use it. It would really revolutionize their entire production and optimize, their businesses. So that's when I kind of decided to make the change and go into tech. And I basically found a computer vision AI startup that focused specifically on manufacturing use cases. And that was my break into technology about, I want to say, almost 4 years ago. So it's kind of crazy that it has been so long. And then it's kind of just blossomed from there. It's been super fun. And basically ended up at Amgen because I feel like the experiences I had at the startups really gave me a lot of exposure to a very diverse range of needs in manufacturing. And I've seen, the experts who have done a really good job in implementing AI, different companies do that firsthand. I've also seen what doesn't work. So I'm really excited to bring, some of those lessons to Amgen and, do my best to help them out in any way.
That's cool. So it sounds like you sort of led your career with more of the business side, and then you added the technology layer a little bit later on, or a little bit more recently. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah. So I think that I was always a technical and business blend, I guess I'd say. And ironically, in a sales role, which has been my past, I've always been very interested in the tech side of things. So,
Yeah.
but so I've come to this position now that to be honest, I'm excited not to be in sales for a little bit.
Yeah.
It'll be nice to be on the other side of things.
Yeah, and do real work instead of just kidding to all the salespeople that might be listening right now.
Yes.
Well, speaking of the audience here today, I want to just real quickly acknowledge, while we're doing introductions here, quickly acknowledge where everyone's joining from today. We have someone, I don't see the name, but on LinkedIn from Monterrey, Mexico. Darian's joining from Denver. Even joining from Croatia. Saif, Saif didn't say where he's from, but hi Saif. Vipin from Boston. Sam Graham from Spain. Welcome back, Sam. I haven't seen you in a few weeks. Saif from Pakistan. Jonathan from Greenville, South Carolina, kind of close to where you are right now.
Yeah.
Okay. And Craig from Hereford, UK. Babek from Iran. So thank you. Just a few examples of where people are joining from today. Thanks for being here. Appreciate that. And again, if you have questions as we get started here, I'd love to hear your comments and questions here in the chat. So I guess as we get started in this conversation, Kate, how would you summarize how AI and manufacturing has evolved, where we stand here today in mid 2024?
Yeah, so it's funny. I mentioned I've loved technology and data, but when I went to school, which feels like forever ago now, and when it comes to AI and technology, it kind of is forever ago now. Essentially, leveraging data meant getting information from a machine in hindsight, and then being able to run analyses from historic data. And that was pretty complex, a little bit clunky, and it didn't really provide real-time information. So you're always going back retroactively to kind of solve your problems. I think that what AI has done and how it's helped manufacturers evolve, who've been able to utilize it, is allowed them to see things in real time, and in some cases even be more predictive and getting ahead of things in what might come out of the historic data, and being able to predict what could come down the line. No pun intended in the production process. And how AI's evolved specifically, I think that there's a lot. What I've realized is that it does help when there are AI companies that specialize in manufacturing, because it is such a complicated space to implement such complex technology. So I guess that's what I would say is I think that the domain expertise and the specialization of AI companies, or portions of an AI company specializing in manufacturing, has really helped AI evolve. And especially like these companies now understand use cases and can kind of repeat their successes and grow their products in a way that's more geared towards the needs of a dynamic environment like manufacturing.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I feel like AI is having a big impact on all kinds of industries, not just manufacturing, but I do think that manufacturing has sort of a unique opportunity to make even better use of AI than any other organization, largely because, like you said, the complexity of manufacturing organizations sort of lends itself to potential AI value. And also the data, you talked about the data a moment ago. When you look at all the data that a manufacturer captures, from the shop floor to the back office, to the supply chain, to the customer side, I mean, there's just so many data points that if you could figure out how to use AI to make better use of it, I feel like it's really ripe for high business value there.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you, I know it's a big thing, and I know that, manufacturers are starting to figure out like how to use AI. And I think a lot of them are struggling with it, sort of how you alluded to that. But what do you think will happen, as you look to like the rest of this year into 2025? If you had to predict the future, which I know you can't, neither can I, but if you kind of look at where we're headed, how do you think manufacturers will start to adapt? I know you talked about AI providers being a little bit more specialized for the needs of manufacturers, but how could manufacturers themselves, do you think, or how do you think they will start to adapt and maybe start to get some momentum behind some of their AI initiatives?
Well, I think the pressure of right now, I think we're at like the cusp of seeing the early users of AI and early adapters of AI. They're going to start to, really break away from the other later to the game manufacturers. I think that there's going to be a very clear distinction between, manufacturers that have leveraged their data in a competitive advantage way. And I think that that's going to provide a little bit of urgency to manufacturers who haven't really committed and been able to follow through with implementing data-driven technology in their production. And I think that what's maybe holding them back more than the technology is the challenges that come with, people and the organization and changing the way manufacturing operates as a whole. We went from pretty siloed roles and responsibilities, like maintenance was maintenance, operations is operations, and that's not, and then business is business, IT is IT. And then when it comes to implementing AI, you need a much more holistic approach. So if the manufacturers that are lagging a little bit behind, I think that what they'll need to do is get really serious about really intentional about their commitment to implementing these technologies.
Yeah. Do you think manufacturers are going to know, even if they are committed to it? Like say they say, okay, yeah, we're committed to AI. We're going to double down on it. We're going to invest heavily in it. Are you saying that they know how to get started, or do you see them struggling with where do we begin? Because I feel like you said, it's such a big, complex animal, the whole manufacturing space. It can be overwhelming.
I think that's their biggest challenge is, it's so large in scope, and the leaders know they want to implement AI, but they're like, what does that even mean?
Yeah.
And then they're also struggling because there's so many vendors out there that are trying to sell them solutions that, may or may not fit their needs. And it's such a large scope. I think it can be a little bit overwhelming, and it's easy to make the wrong decisions. So I do think that that's something they struggle with. And it's like the paradox of choice. If you have too many choices, you're going to take forever to make one. And a lot of manufacturers want to make sure they have everything perfect before they start to implement technology solutions. And that can hold them back a little bit too, because the longer they're waiting to get their foundational platform perfect, the more technology is evolving and the more they're missing out. So even if they get it perfect in 2 years, AI solutions are going to be much different in 2 years. So yeah. I hope that answers your question. I kind of went a little bit.
No, it does. It's great. And actually, it leads to a follow-up here. This is actually, and I was thinking this exact same thing because, of course, great minds think alike. And Sam Graham is a regular on this show, and he asked, what foundations do companies need to have before putting AI in place? And that was actually the follow-up I was going to ask you too. When you think about the foundation that a manufacturer needs, what do you mean by that?
Sure. Sorry. What I mean by that is manufacturers have all this equipment, right? That's producing data, whether or not they're extracting it and contextualizing it. There's a lot of data that's kind of just hanging around waiting to be used. The foundation that a lot of manufacturers want to put in place is like, especially let's say they have multiple facilities, they want all of their facilities with the exact same tech stack, each of them having, the same historian, the same data lakes and the same technologies. But the challenge is there is they have to evaluate their current tech stack, then eliminate some and then reintroduce some. So it's really, they're trying to create a very consistent standard across their organization. And while I can understand that and appreciate it for like certain pieces of their tech stack, I do think that is a barrier to them implementing more advanced technology sooner. And the foundation, though, I'd say if you want to implement AI, collecting the data from your equipment is like the baseline, right? Yeah. But I don't think you need to do it across your whole facility to get value right away. if you came up with like a use case, thinking, okay, this one line has a bottleneck that I'm sure about. I think it's with the pump. Maybe something's not flowing right. Maybe you want to evaluate one line against 3 others. Focus on collecting the relevant data to that use case. See if it helps solve your problem. Leverage AI for that data specifically, and then you can scale it. Versus making sure you have all the data for all the lines and then applying the AI. I think that is another thing that they could kind of expedite the process a little bit more.
Yeah. And if they could find like some, even if they're little micro, tiny little use cases, if you could find some like pockets of innovation where you're trying out innovation for a little part of your business or a little part of your process, and then once you sort of fine tune it, then you can start to scale it, across the organization. It seems like that, more of an agile type of approach could be a way to do it, rather than trying to take that traditional approach that you might take like with a big ERP system. You're going to, a lot of times take more of a waterfall approach where you try to define all your requirements up front and try to define your end-to-end business processes and then implement the technology. I don't think that's really how AI is going to add value. And I think the technology is changing so fast, it's just going to become outdated by the time you deploy it if you take that sort of slower approach there. Exactly. And for the manufacturers that, are very committed to that approach, I say, fine, go that route. But at the same time, there's opportunity that you can do that. If you cherry pick use cases, you'll get a lot of value there, and might as well start implementing that in parallel, even if you are working on just the foundational part. But computer vision is a really good example, as like, you don't need a big foundation. If you want to understand, maybe you're doing a quality check, leveraging like computer vision, you need, the hardware, and then you need, essentially you're going to be operating on the edge if you want real-time information. So there's some connectivity that's involved, and then whatever analytics platform you're using on top of that, or AI platform on top of that. So the data is a very specific set of information, but it doesn't require that much foundational technology besides, what's specifically involved in that application. Gotcha. Yeah, that makes total sense. Here's a comment from Saif. It's sort of a follow-up comment or a response to Sam's question about what foundational stuff needs to be in place. But Saif has, first of all, plant machinery need to be equipped with PLC. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. Does that mean anything to you, Kate, or do you agree with that? Yeah, I mean, again, I think it's one of those things, like in the situation where, if it's a computer vision application in that very specific use case, I'm not really sure how relevant a PLC specifically is. But yeah, if you wanted, at the last company I was at, if you wanted to build a digital twin, basically you needed a historian where your data was going. So we could use that historic data in order to build that digital twin. So different Industry 4.0 technologies, if you will require different foundation. I'm just saying that there are use cases in AI that don't require as much. However, I will say, if you're not like the bare minimum is you need to be collecting data. It needs to be going somewhere, whether it's a data lake or on-prem, whether it's, a public cloud, or that's pretty much a bare minimum requirement. But other than that, if you have the data going somewhere, that's the foundation, I guess, for AI. Yeah. Now, what about the initial early signs of the impact that AI is having on sort of the human side? And that's part of what we want to talk about here today too, is the change management piece of it. I know so far we've been talking about how we can get our heads around how to use AI or how to build some of these use cases, get the foundation in place to be able to start to deploy AI, maybe even on just a limited scale. But from what limited usage of AI that most manufacturers are seeing right now, what sorts of impacts are you seeing to the human side of the equation, or how do you think AI will impact people, longer term? So how AI will impact, so my favorite thing about it, I'll start with the positives, I guess, is safety is a really great use case, or it's a really beneficial impact of AI on humans in manufacturing settings. So where in the past you might have to go inspect something that's in a dangerous area, maybe it's
very hot, or it's like, you have to kind of crawl through some sketchy crevices that might be dangerous. Now you can leverage, robotics and computer vision to go and make assessments, in basically replacing the human when it comes to the physical evaluation, and also making the work environment safer. Because if you're evaluating or trying to understand how your equipment is just from a safety perspective, if you're able to do that more consistently and find trends in your data, then you're more likely to be able to prevent incidences from occurring, just like you would optimize your production. So from a human impact, I think safety is one of the best things that are going to be coming from this. Also with ergonomics, being able to automate tasks that were ergonomically unhealthy for humans, I think that will be beneficial as well. And then empowering like operators who are hands-on. A lot of times they might not know exactly what to do if something's going wrong. It might be like a gut check. So empowering operators with like specific information in real time, I think is, just another aid and another tool. I will say it's important to think about the actual technology that's communicating to the operators. There's an example that someone gave that they invested a lot of money in really heavy tablets. And so their entire manufacturing facility, they all got these really heavy tablets. And they didn't really talk to the operators about it to get their input before they made the purchases. And no one was using them. And they were like, well, why aren't you using them? And they got that information, that feedback. So I think it's really important on both sides, like getting the human feedback and really incorporating everybody who is working in manufacturing settings, incorporating them in the solutions so that it does provide value to them and make their lives easier, as I would assume the intention is for most companies.
I'm here playing a clip of my conversation with Kate Arndt to talk about AI and change management. We've got a lot more to cover, but first we're going to take a quick break. We'll be back with more Transformation Ground Control.
Just tell me what you've got to say to me. I've been waiting for so long to hear the truth.
If you are involved in any sort of digital transformation or business change initiative, you'll want to download the Digital Transformation Report. With its comprehensive overview of business and technology trends and best practices, this report is a must-have guide for any transformation project or executive team. Download this free report by visiting Third Stage Consulting at thirdstage-consulting.com. You can also visit our website to learn more about us or download independent reports, videos, and other best practices. Again, visit thirdstage-consulting.com today to learn how you can take your transformation to the third stage of success.
I want to invite you to join me and other thought leaders in the digital transformation space to Stratosphere 2025. It's an annual conference we've hosted now for 7 years in a row. It's a great event. It's live in Denver, Colorado, but we're also offering it virtually via hybrid tickets. And we're going to have a lot of different speakers here, including myself as a keynote, as well as others that you may know from the industry. And this is a perfect conference if you're interested in any sort of digital transformation, including ERP and CRM and HCM. And actually the theme for this year's session is AI and how AI is affecting all different types of digital transformation. But in addition to AI, we'll also talk about the fundamentals of digital transformation, including program management, evaluating the right software, digital strategy, change management, process improvement, all the things you need to know to make your project successful. It's also a great way to network and learn from others. So just being part of a community that is also like-minded and going through the same things you are, that's another value. And you can join, like I said, remotely in person, and you can also buy VIP tickets if you'd like more exclusive access to me and others from the Third Stage team and other speakers that are going to be there. So I hope to see you soon. Check out my discount code below for discounted tickets. You can go to stratosphere2025.com for more information, including the full agenda, and I hope to see you there.
Are you looking for ways to promote your product or service to enterprise technology decision makers and influencers throughout the world, like the ones who listen to this podcast? Major Tom Productions creates media, events, and influencer marketing for B2B technology providers. Our productions are exciting, educational, disruptive, and effective. Most importantly, they create results. Our content is unlike any other in this industry, engaging, influential, and trusted by technology buyers and influencers throughout the world. Each month, our productions reach hundreds of thousands of targeted buyers and decision makers who trust and engage with our honest and tech-agnostic content. With long-tail viral results and engagement with our content, Major Tom Productions provides a way to reach your target market and create awareness, calls to action, and a connection with potential customers. So, collaborate with us today. Learn how we can feature your product or service on podcasts such as Transformation Ground Control, Journey to S/4HANA, and Journey to Dynamics 365. We can also feature your brand on our YouTube channel called Digital Transformation with Eric Kimberling, which boasts over 100,000 subscribers and over 2 million video views per year. You can also participate in our in-person events, including our Digital Stratosphere Conference. Contact us today to learn more. We can tailor a marketing campaign that works for you. We look forward to helping more people learn more about and become engaged with your brand.
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 226. You can find new episodes of this show every Wednesday by going to transformationgroundcontrol.com. The show is sponsored by Third Stage Consulting, and we're here with Kate Arntz talking about AI and change management. You're sort of answering this question. I'll pop it up anyway, even though I think you just sort of alluded to it or answered it, but this is from someone on LinkedIn. I don't see the name. I apologize, but it says, what are the critical challenges in implementing AI in manufacturing, and how can change management practices address these challenges to ensure a smooth transition? And sort of you give a good example there of what happens when you don't do good change management with the tablets and people weren't using them. Is there any other advice you'd have for companies as they think about just change management strategies that might be helpful for them?
Sure. So many stakeholders. That's one of the biggest things I'll say on both sides of the spectrum, whether I'm selling technology to a manufacturer or I'm a manufacturer and I'm trying to implement technology. I kind of mentioned this before, but in the past, manufacturing pieces of the organization in manufacturing all had their own scorecard, so to speak. They had their own goals. And if you want to implement AI effectively, then you need input from every single, silo in order to make it effective from a business perspective. And starting with the business value, I think that's the other thing that manufacturers kind of are a little disconnected about sometimes, because maybe it's the technology group, like I'm part of the technology group, but if we're not thinking about the business value of implementing technology in our manufacturing facilities, then we're not aligned with our overall goals. And that can lead to digital debt, another buzzword I hear, but you're making these massive investments. And if you don't have that alignment from manufacturing and the business side of things, then, and you don't start with like a lot of intention and a use case, then it could lead to that. And I think that's another piece of it. I think the upfront planning is really important. And when I say that, I mean upfront planning in the exact use case that's going to bring you value. So my favorite way to go about that is kind of brainstorming where a use case might be most feasible. And by feasible, I mean where you have the data and where you have people that have the appetite to try something. So if you have multiple facilities, which facility is most likely to take on a technology to kind of learn about it and be the, example for others. And then they have the data, they have the resources. And then I also like to brainstorm based on the impact and the business value. And so based on those two scores, kind of ranking the use cases, and whichever one has the biggest business impact and is the most feasible, that's where I recommend starting out, and then scaling should it, provide value.
Right. Yeah. Makes total sense. We're getting a lot of good comments and questions here and actually humorous ones too, which I always appreciate. Speaking of humorous comments, this is from Will Quinn on LinkedIn. Says, "Wait, leaders didn't consult with frontline employees before deploying a new tool? What? I've never heard that happen either. So I'm shocked, just as shocked as Will is to hear that. But kidding aside, that is a very real issue, obviously, with a lot of manufacturers. Here's a comment. I want to pull this up. This is getting a little. I'll forewarn you, Kate. This is getting a little outside the scope of anything that I can answer. This is way over my head because we're getting into literature and stuff here, and that's not my thing. But this is from Sam. Sam Graham on LinkedIn says, in the 19th century, Charles Babbage, he corrected it on his next comment. He said it's actually Charles Babbage developed a mechanical computer that almost worked. He reported being asked, "Pray, Mr. Babbage, if you put into the machine wrong figures, will the right answer come out? Is there a danger of AI generating a similar question?" So in other words, if the data is bad, is that going to create problems for AI?
Yeah. Yes. That's why I call it like a data pipeline, especially if you're getting data from various sources. You need to put a lot of time and effort into that data pipeline to extract the data and contextualize it. And you need to have somebody that owns the data integrity. An example that I'm going to be stealing from one of my Industry 4.0 club team members is in her facility, for some reason, the Fahrenheit temperature data changed to Celsius all of a sudden. Totally obviously changed everything that they were getting from their AI. And that was where she realized, okay, if we're going to be implementing this stuff, there needs to be somebody who's monitoring this, because, depending on your application, it could cause a lot of problems.
Right. Yeah, totally. And you don't want to assume, well, because it's AI, it must be right, even especially if you've got bad data going in there.
Well, we've all seen ChatGPT's, incorrect answers. So
yes, we have.
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the first things I did when I first used ChatGPT was I entered in the prompt. I said, tell me who the leading independent digital transformation consulting firms were, because I was hoping to see Third Stage on there. It did not tell me Third Stage, but what it told me is all these other companies that are not independent. So I was like, that's not true, because those companies are affiliated with software vendors. So I was a little jaded early on, but I think it's actually getting a lot better. But still, there's still wrong data out there that ChatGPT is drawing from in certain cases, and you just have to be aware and know that you've been disciplined about your data cleanup and your data governance and all that stuff, which has always been important. But I think manufacturers have struggled a lot with that over the years.
And that's another good point of what might be holding manufacturers back, or like the critical challenges, right? Resources. Everybody wants to implement these solutions, but I don't think they understand like the independent resources that need to be responsible for these projects. Because everybody that has the day job in a manufacturing facility, they don't have the time to take on an AI project as well. And often it requires their input, but there needs to be more people who are coming in and helping out versus like people who already have a day job,
Right. Yeah. Makes total sense. Here's another comment from Will on LinkedIn. He says, AI really starts to gain traction when you have an industry expert working with the development team to create real life use cases that help their customers gain value. And that's a great point. I think more so than even other technology initiatives, you need IT and business representation. And Kate, you mentioned all the stakeholders that need to be involved too. There's just a lot of collaboration that goes into making these AI initiatives work. Here's a really interesting question that kind of put you on the spot here, Kate. This is from Luis on LinkedIn. Luis says, what is more critical, people's involvement in the project or integration between systems? Which I feel like they're both important, but do you feel like one is more important than the other?
That's the magic question. I guess, the integration one's easier to answer because it depends on the application. That's my, cheating answer, right? But obviously that's super important. I'd say that when it comes to what's hindering manufacturers from leveraging AI, it's the people, the organization. And I'm not saying people are getting in the way on purpose. I'm saying it's hard to completely change how you operate. It's hard to implement I didn't like when I got a new CRM or something, you know, and it was one tool and had nothing to do with AI. I just didn't want to use a new system. So implementing technology that's going to like be part of a person's day-to-day and expecting them to use it is such a big challenge. In fact, that's one of the things that Amgen tracks. Of all the tools that they're implementing, they're tracking, you know, utilization and getting input from their employees. And then that's a big consideration that they're making when they're evaluating implementing a technology is, will people use this? And because, you know, if no one's going to use it, then it's kind of not worth. The technology can be great, but if no one's using it, it won't really matter.
Yeah, I agree. Here's an area we haven't really touched yet is this is from Saif on LinkedIn. He says, can AI help with supply chain management like material planning and production planning in manufacturing? What are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. I think that is a really tough space just with the outlier events. But, you know, if you kind of take the outliers out of the equation, it's very beneficial. Getting real-time information from your supply, the further you can go down either upline or downstream, I'd say, I guess, upline if you're trying to plan for your production process itself. If you get better information going in, you're going to know a lot more on how to optimize your production based on that. And then also the demand that's pulling from your facilities. So demand planning is definitely, I think, an opportunity when it comes to supply. And then also quality is another thing in supply. I guess that's really relevant and important, especially like, I don't know, some paper recycling mills, for example, they have suppliers and get a lot of variety in what they're recycling. And those inputs matter a lot in their production and how to kind of tweak what they're doing in order to make the product to spec. So I think that understanding that data going in and collecting data, that's just an example from these suppliers and knowing what's coming kind of helps set you up for success to optimize your production, you know, according to what's coming in.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's where so much of the complexity is too. When you get to material planning, production planning, that's where there's a lot of opportunity to take just mass amounts of data and make better use of it and augment the human tribal knowledge that's probably been running your supply chain and your material management, your MRP and all that stuff for the years past. What about career prospects? When you think about, you know, people's careers in manufacturing and in technology, how do we navigate our careers differently now, you know, knowing that AI is a thing and it's here to stay? Does it change our career approach, or what kind of skills should we be developing? What are your thoughts there?
Well, if you're asking me personally, I did an Ikigai exercise where, have you heard of that?
No.
Practice? Okay. Essentially like 4 Venn diagrams when you're trying to figure out your career. I guess like what you're good at. I'm going to forget all 4 now that I'm on the spot a little bit. What you're good at, what the world needs, what you can make money in, and then what you enjoy doing. So where those converge. And that's kind of how I picked my career. And what I'm getting at is AI was a massive consideration in my choices in my career. Personally, I think that it's here to stay. And the more, you know, experience that you can get, hands-on experience with it, especially in more complex applications, I guess the more valuable I think you'll be long-term. I guess what I'm getting at is get your hands dirty, you know, like just if you can get access to learning about AI, I think it's a very important skill set to have moving forward in career opportunities. Like it's obviously a massive thing that employers are looking for is people with AI experience. For, you know, I know AI has been around forever. Everyone will say that, but when it comes to the recent AI boom, that talent is, you know, still a small pool. So if you can break into that, I think it would be of value as far as, differentiating yourself from other people.
Yeah. I agree. And you get ahead of the curve. I mean, it's an opportunity to leapfrog other people that are starting their careers or trying to make a change. So the more you can do there, the better.
And it's fun. You learn a lot too.
Yeah.
I think that's why I like it so much. It's still so fairly new that you're problem solving all the time.
Yeah. Very much so. And like we've been saying, the common theme we keep coming back to is there's so many different ways you can use AI. So there's a lot of opportunity there. And also data science too. I noticed that it seems like a lot more younger people coming out of university now are focusing on data science, even if they're not wanting to get directly into technology. It seems like that's just a hot trend just from what we're seeing in the market right now, which I think is smart to focus on the data side of things. What about other than AI, in addition to AI, what are some of the other technological considerations or trends or risks? What are you seeing that's really important to manufacturers right now in the ones you've worked with?
Well, you mentioned CrowdStrike, right?
Yeah.
Friday. Okay. That's a big one. So if you are going to be implementing AI in manufacturing, depending on the applications and what risk you might be subject to should your AI stop working or you lose connection, having a multi-cloud approach, I think, is of value. I had 2 experiences with public cloud providers where my customers weren't able to, use their AI in their production, and they relied on it. And if operators are, unable to get that information, it throws them off in a way that's definitely not good for manufacturing and production. And then when it comes down to risk, it's like, depending on what you're producing, it's one thing if it's like, I don't know, fidget spinners. I don't know what manufacturing facility makes those. That's just the first thing that came to my mind. But like, who cares if those get, it's not going to harm anyone. But if you're producing something in biotech and you don't have connectivity and you're reliant on it, it's a big risk. So I'd say like reliability, both from the a network connection, and then also cybersecurity. These are more general considerations, but I think it's needs to be built into your overall strategy and who you decide to partner with, making sure that you vet them out appropriately and understanding the risk. So if you're going to do like a closed loop control in your production process, know what happens if, it stops working all of a sudden.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And you made a good point about the higher risk your product or the higher risk your product is, then obviously the more risk you have with cybersecurity, and AI hallucinations and other issues from other technological issues as well. I know a lot, like with the CrowdStrike thing, a lot of hospitals were impacted. Banks, when you're dealing with people's money, that's always a risk. When you're dealing with people traveling, that's always a risk. So a lot of high profile, high stakes sort of impacts there. So and you mentioned safety and regulatory. You had that whole thread a few minutes ago about the safety and regulatory side of things too. I mean, you really do have to be extra cautious in some of these critical areas when you're deploying any sort of new technology, and recognize those risks, like you said. Let's see. Sorry, I'm trying to pick between like 3 really good questions here. Not that I have to pick only one, but I'm trying to figure out what order to go in here. Here's a question from Saif on LinkedIn. What are the key points needed to review to evaluate organizations' readiness before opting any AI solution? I suppose this gets back to that foundational piece. We talked about data, things like that. What if you were to what are some of your thoughts there, in addition to what we've already discussed around some of the things that need to be in place or to show that we're ready? You also mentioned, by the way, the executives have to be on board and the organization has to be committed to AI. That's another thing, or prerequisite. Are there other prerequisites you could think of that we'd want to make sure we have to ensure that we're ready for an AI initiative?
Sure. So when I was in my sales role, and I'll probably still do this internally at Amgen, but I had like a set of questions I'd ask every single manufacturing leader that I was, having a discovery call with, in order to evaluate whether or not I could sell them my product, right? So when I was at the computer vision startup, it was essentially the easiest way for us to integrate into their production was, and the one question they needed to answer was, do they have their data on the cloud? Because if they did, it made it very easy to get that data through like a quick API pull, and then process it through our platform and provide them the solutions that they might be looking for. So that was for a computer vision application, and you'd be surprised at how many manufacturers weren't willing to put their data on the cloud, or you might not be surprised, but that was a big thing. So that would kind of almost, not to say that it would totally eliminate them from leveraging computer vision, but it would make it a little bit longer of a process, and require more effort into accessing that data. For example, if a manufacturer had their data on-prem, that was always a challenge. And I understand, the reasons behind that, but it makes it a little bit harder to implement AI quickly. And then from like that exact example, but then some of the other questions are about, the personnel. Like, do you have, a facility, or are there people in your organization that are willing to, they have an appetite for this and they want to, be part of this? That buy-in is really important. And if you don't have that buy-in, that's a big block. I'd say that's a big block for AI readiness in general. Then when it comes to like the foundational AI readiness evaluation, I guess what I'd say is, definitely if you're just collecting data on like an Excel sheet, that's going to be a little bit down the road. You need to have hardware that's able to generate the data and collect the data. Connectivity is really important. But I mean, again, it kind of depends on the use case and the application. You don't have to do the whole facility if you just have a hunch that something's going wrong in one aspect. Like sensors, for example. I was talking to one, like somebody at a lube blend plant, and he had a hunch that there was something. I kind of was alluding to this earlier. I'll give you more context though. He was saying that he thought that one of his 8 blending lines, one of them, a pump was going slower, and he really wanted that pump replaced, but upline wouldn't let him get it replaced because he had no way to prove his suspicion. And I was like, well, you can find that out if you just buy pump sensors, and it's not that expensive. So if he were to go get pump sensors and, do a comparison, he could understand that, validate his concern. But the other benefit there is by collecting that data and corroborating it maybe with data upline, like in lubricants, you're basically, it's a recipe that's very specific and you need it to come out a certain way. Knowing how your equipment is operating is vital, but then also knowing what the ingredients are that are coming through is really important too. So the AI readiness in that equation could be as simple as, a couple sensors and quality data on the front end, and then quality data on the back end. So it doesn't need to be a massive data collection, but if you don't have data being stored somewhere and collecting somewhere, then that would be the hindrance to being able to leverage AI.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and it's huge. I mean, what you just said is huge for a lot of manufacturers. I mean, a lot of them don't have that readiness or those foundational elements in place. So, while we're all excited about AI, we also have to sort of back up at times and say, well, what are the foundational pieces we need before we can really realistically use AI? And I think that's a big challenge for companies today, and something that I would think sort of puts them at risk of potentially falling behind the whole AI trend or movement is, because if you're busy fixing all these foundational pieces, even though you need to, technology is changing, other people are getting ahead. So, I mean, the sooner you can get some of these things in place, I think the better.
Yeah. And also, was it Will that said, the industry expertise is beneficial. I think
Yeah.
that's really true. Like, given that I was able to work with so many manufacturers, and I was able to do this exercise with so many manufacturers in different industries, I got a good handle on use cases and applications where it could be very feasible and provide a lot of value very quickly. So I started to become pretty good at knowing what questions to ask in order to get to that value and feasibility, and then come up with a plan, because obviously my job at the time was to sell technology. So I wanted to make it a big ROI for them. And without that industry expertise and then the experience, seeing successes and failures, I wouldn't know how to get to that ROI as quickly. And that's where I think a lot of the bigger tech companies, well, of course they have expertise. Sometimes they don't have as micro expertise in manufacturing. So the solutions they're proposing don't always have an ROI because they don't really know how to implement it effectively where it might result in one. And I think that's another thing for manufacturers who haven't implemented AI much, is they also don't really know where to start in all cases. Sometimes they do, but it is a challenging experiment and thought exercise. But when you have that planning right up front, it's worth it.
Yeah. Yeah. So if we sort of summarize a lot of what we've talked about here today, and, we've talked a lot about different trends, a lot of foundational things we need to have in place before we can take advantage of AI. We've talked about how we could start to leverage AI on a small use case basis. So we talked about a lot of stuff. And again, coming back to the whole thread we've been circling around, which is this is complicated stuff. It can be overwhelming. There's a lot of options, a lot of choices, a lot of directions we can go with AI. If we sort of back up and you were going to give us sort of a high level roadmap, how should a manufacturer just get started to navigate some of these different opportunities and challenges that we're talking about?
So start with the business need first and foremost. That's the other thing. Depending on the role, right, I'll ask, what is your goal in your role? So if it's somebody in operations, it's probably throughput or yield, or if you're in paper, it's reducing variance or variability. So I start with that, and then I'm like, okay, well, why? And tying it to the business value. Well, what if you were able to increase throughput by a percentage? What would that mean financially? So then we know the goal and what you're trying to do. And then it's okay, well, tell me about your production process and what is holding you back from, improving your production by 1%. And then you get more information there. Then, okay, well, do you have data? Are you collecting data? Do you have the hardware, the sensors that are producing the data? Okay, great. So then let's go ahead and implement it. And if it works and you get business value that you thought you would, if we reach this goal of increasing throughput by a percentage, and it brings you that value, you can justify then scaling it across your production lines, or if you have more than one facility. So the roadmap is start with the business, like whatever your goals are in your business organization at a very high level, even if it's as generic as, increasing your throughput, safety, whatever. Then from there, well, where could it actually fit in an application where we can just try it out and get value? Because that's what's going to justify the long-term commitment to that technology. And it's one of those things that can help you like fail fast or succeed fast. And basically, so if you start with the business value, you create a good team that's willing to go execute. And it starts also too with the leadership. You have to also reward this behavior, incentivize, and then also showcase the successes. Everybody wants to be part of, a positive project. And if you show off the facility that's successfully implemented something, it creates more buy-in from peers and it can spread. So business value, specific use case, start small even, and then scale if it works. And then from a roadmap of like implementing new, like your foundational technologies, if you have more than one facility, maybe just start with one and see what works, and then scale it that way. But if you have one and you're not very digitally advanced yet, I guess I'd say prioritize investing in that hardware, and that if you're going to get a historian that takes a little bit of time, but that would be the foundational pieces that you need to kind of start with.
Yeah. And you may not have the whole long-term roadmap figured out, and you may not know enough to be able to say, here's our 3 to 5 year AI and technology roadmap, but you could start, like you said, on a smaller scale and at least have some sort of deliberate plan of how you're going to get started. And then as you learn and innovate and scale, then, obviously you can pivot and adjust as you need to, as you keep going.
Well, what I say about the people that have a 5-year roadmap is it's never, it's rare that they stick to that 5-year roadmap.
Yeah.
But also, measuring, like the people part of it too, understanding, is it being utilized long-term? And I think that's the important thing to know. Just as AI is evolving and changing rapidly, I think our approaches to it need to be the same, and our attitudes towards it needs to be the same if we're going to actually get a lot of value. The manufacturers that do the best job are like the lighthouse facility manufacturers. And I'd say that that's what they're really good at. They just go for it and they do it. I don't get held back by overthinking and wanting to do the massive scope. Picking specific spots where you can implement it and get value. That's where you're going to make change.
All right. So that was my conversation with Kate talking about AI and change management. Very fascinating conversation. I love the intersection of AI as sort of this cool, fast changing, emerging technology, but the intersection of that, or the collision of that technology with people and resistance to change and human nature and all that stuff. I found that conversation to be very interesting. And if you'd like to learn more about change management in general too, by the way, I encourage you to read our Guide to Organizational Change Management. It's a guide that I wrote not too long ago. It's got a lot of good tips and best practices for how to make your change initiatives more successful. So as a complementary piece or a supplementary piece to this podcast episode, I encourage you to download that white paper, that report. You can do so by scanning the QR code right here in front of you, or you can go to the links below if you're listening to the audio only version, especially. So I hope you found today's episode useful. If you'd like to learn more about how Third Stage can help, or if you just like to brainstorm ideas related to your change management initiatives, I encourage you to reach out to me. I've included my contact information below, and be happy to have an informal chat with you about your project and some of the recommendations I might give you if that's helpful. So I hope you found this episode helpful. We'll be back next Wednesday, same time, same place. Go to transformationgroundcontrol.com. In the meantime, if you'd like to see past episodes that you might have missed. Otherwise, we'll see you next week, and hope you have a great week in the meantime. Take care.